Before Egypt was a kingdom, it was a river, and the river itself became divine. From its first settled communities in the 6th millennium BCE, the Nile Valley offered an environment unlike any other in the ancient world. While the deserts of North Africa stretched vast and unyielding, the Nile's annual inundation transformed its narrow corridor into a predictable cycle of fertility. Archaeological studies of early Neolithic sites such as Merimde Beni Salama in the western delta and the Fayum culture in Middle Egypt indicate that human occupation followed the river's rhythms closely. The seasonal rise and fall of the flood shaped early subsistence patterns and settlement locations, producing one of the earliest examples of ecological dependence translated into spiritual understanding. Records of pollen analysis, faunal remains, and settlement stratigraphy from Merimde reveal alternating layers of habitation and abandonment consistent with flood variation. This physical rhythm corresponded to what later Egyptians called ma'at, a principle of order and balance regulating both the cosmos and society. Though the term would not appear in texts until the Old Kingdom, its conceptual foundation can be observed in the Neolithic experience of the river's regularity. The Nile's dependable cycles provided an empirical model for stability, and from this, an early perception of a world governed by law rather than chance began to form. The surrounding geography reinforced this sense of divine isolation. To the west and east, desert plateaus created natural frontiers, protecting the floodplain from nomadic intrusion but also restricting expansion. The desert was perceived as a space of chaos and death, while the cultivated land, renewed annually by the inundation, represented life and order. Archaeologists have noted that early grave goods in pre-dynastic cemeteries at El Omari and Mahdi show an intentional orientation toward the west, the direction of the setting sun and the arid wasteland beyond. This dualism between fertile valley and lifeless desert became the earliest geographic metaphor for the boundary between existence and non-existence, later embodied in myths of the sun god Ra's nightly journey through the underworld. Environmental determinism was not absolute, yet its influence was pervasive. The Nile's north-south orientation and steady flow encouraged communication along its length, while the deserts prevented lateral expansion. This longitudinal structure produced a cultural continuum from the delta to Nubia, allowing ideas, symbols, and technologies to diffuse efficiently. By around 4500 BCE, the communities of the Fayum and Badari regions were already experimenting with shared ceramic motifs, spirals, waves, and animal forms that would later appear in royal iconography. Scholars such as Toby Wilkinson and Catherine Bard interpret these designs as more than decorative. They reflected an emerging symbolic grammar derived from natural observation. The spiral evoked water movement, the wave, the flood, the animal, the local manifestation of vitality. Thus, nature itself became a coded system for expressing the sacred. Archaeological evidence suggests that this symbolic order was already linked to ritual practice. Excavations at the Fayum Basin uncovered small clay figurines of cattle and humans, often associated with hearths or storage pits. Radiocarbon dating places these artifacts around 5200 BCE, implying that fertility rites tied to animal abundance and agricultural renewal predated formal temples by several millennia. The ritual logic is clear. Survival depended on the Nile's generosity, and human behavior sought to ensure its continuity through symbolic performance. Such practices form the prehistoric foundation of Egypt's later temple economy, in which offerings, festivals, and ceremonies perpetuated cosmic balance. Interpretively, this early period demonstrates how environmental regularity can produce theological abstraction. The Nile's predictability stood in contrast to the volatility of Mesopotamian rivers, which often flooded erratically. Consequently, Egypt developed a religion grounded in confidence rather than fear, one that emphasized harmony, regeneration, and cosmic order. The gods who would later populate Egyptian temples, Ra, Osiris, and Isis, did not emerge as capricious forces of destruction, but as guarantors of cyclical stability. The physical landscape thus dictated not only subsistence strategy but also psychological orientation. By the late 6th millennium BCE, archaeological surveys show gradual increases in settlement permanence. Sites such as Merimde expanded to nearly 40 hectares, incorporating distinct zones for habitation, craft production, and animal corrals. This spatial organization hints at emerging social differentiation and collective management of water and resources. In religious terms, shared irrigation and flood watching required cooperation, fostering communal rituals that reinforced unity. Anthropologists draw parallels between these early gatherings and later temple festivals, both functioning as mechanisms for social cohesion and environmental negotiation. The earliest tangible signs of sacred space also belong to this phase. At Hierakonpolis, later known as Nekhen, archaeologists uncovered a series of ceremonial structures predating 3500 BCE, including animal burials and ritual enclosures. Although slightly later than Merimde, these finds suggest continuity from Neolithic ritual to early urban cult. The use of controlled space, aligned with celestial or hydraulic markers, reflects an understanding of the sacred as both localized and systemic, an early prototype of the temple as microcosm. Two interpretive insights arise from these patterns. First, Egyptian cosmology developed not through revelation or imported theology, but as a response to ecological constancy. The river's reliability served as a natural model for divine order. Second, religious authority evolved in tandem with social organization. Those who predicted floods or organized communal labor acquired both practical and spiritual prestige. This fusion of environmental expertise and ritual leadership set the foundation for later priesthoods and, ultimately, divine kingship. Material culture reinforces this trajectory. Rock carvings near Kurta in Upper Egypt, dating possibly to 20,000 BCE but reused in later periods, depict animals such as hippos, fish, and cattle. Their re-engagement by Neolithic communities indicates a long cultural memory associating fauna with sacred vitality. When the first temples emerged millennia later, their iconography retained these early symbols, transforming ecological motifs into theological emblems. By 400 BCE, the Nile Valley was a chain of interlinked communities sustained by agriculture, trade, and shared ritual life. The conceptual boundary between nature and divinity had dissolved. The river, the land, and the cosmos were aspects of one integrated system. This worldview would underpin Egyptian religion for 3,000 years, shaping its myths, its kingship, and its vision of the afterlife. As Nile communities grew into proto-cities, sacred symbols began to coalesce into deities. Long before the pharaohs, the gods already had symbols. Between 400 and 3100 BCE, the cultural landscape of the Nile Valley entered a period of transformation that would crystallize the foundations of Egyptian religion. This pre-dynastic era, known archaeologically through the Naqada 1, 2, and 3 phases, marks the transition from regional village societies to the first organized states of the early dynastic period. Within this process, symbols of power, fertility, and protection began to take recognizable divine form. Excavations at Hierakonpolis, Naqada, Abydos, and El Amr reveal not only evolving artistic expression but also an increasingly complex set of ritual behaviors. These proto-religious systems, still fluid and local, laid the conceptual groundwork for the gods, iconography, and cult practices that would define pharaonic civilization. Archaeological and artistic evidence from Naqada I, circa 4000 to 3600 BCE, shows the earliest emergence of animal symbolism associated with the sacred. Pottery and palette carvings depict falcons, bulls, and serpents rendered with deliberate stylization. The falcon, later identified with Horus, appears frequently on decorated ceramics and small figurines. Its association with the sky and the horizon suggests early solar or celestial veneration, perhaps linked to cycles of light and authority. Similarly, the bull motif, represented in painted scenes and ivory carvings, conveyed strength and fertility. Later theological developments would reinterpret this symbol within the cults of Hathor and Apis, but its pre-dynastic roots are unmistakably agricultural, tied to cattle wealth and male virility. These early zoomorphic figures were not yet gods in the formal sense, but embodied spiritual principles projected onto the natural world. By Naqada II, circa 3600 to 3300 BCE, religious expression had become more organized and materially visible. Archaeologists uncovered evidence of ceremonial standards, poles topped with carved emblems representing local cults or territorial identities. These standards, found in tomb paintings and grave goods, display motifs such as birds, canines, and mythic creatures, each likely corresponding to a regional deity or guardian spirit. Their later appearance on royal processional scenes in the early dynastic period indicates institutional continuity. The same symbols that once represented village gods would eventually become the insignia of a unified state religion. The cemetery at Hierakonpolis, ancient Nekon, provides the clearest insight into these emerging cultic systems. Excavations led by Michael Hoffman and Barbara Adams revealed elaborate burials of both humans and animals dating to circa 3600 to 3300 BCE. One remarkable find: a complex containing the graves of sacred baboons and wild cats, suggests the earliest evidence of animal cults in Egypt. These animals were not domesticated for utility but interred ceremonially, often accompanied by offerings. Archaeologists interpret these acts as expressions of spiritual alliance between humans and powerful creatures, embodying protective or intermediary forces. The conceptual logic here anticipates later Egyptian theology, in which gods manifest through animal forms while retaining human intelligence and purpose. The same site produced large ceremonial maces, pallets, and vessels used in ritual contexts rather than combat or domestic life. Among these, the famous Narmer pallet of the subsequent Naqada III period stands as the culmination of this symbolic evolution. It depicts a ruler, presumably Narmer, wearing the crowns of both Upper and Lower Egypt, attended by divine standards and the falcon god Horus overseeing his triumph. Although produced on the threshold of written history, the imagery preserves centuries of symbolic accumulation. The falcon here is no longer a local spirit. It has become the guardian of kingship, expressing divine sanction for political unification. Interpretively, the Naqada sequence demonstrates how religious iconography evolved in parallel with socio-political consolidation. In Naqada I, symbols are dispersed and local. By Naqada III, they converge into a shared visual grammar of authority. This correlation suggests that religious imagery functioned as a unifying medium, allowing disparate communities to identify within a larger cultural framework. The adoption of common divine emblems thus prefigured the eventual political integration of Upper and Lower Egypt. Archaeological data also reveals the beginnings of belief in an afterlife. Pre-dynastic graves exhibit increasing investment in mortuary offerings, pottery vessels, cosmetics, stone tools, and ornaments placed beside the dead. Tomb architecture grows progressively elaborate, with separate chambers and superstructures. At Naqada and Abydos, some high-status graves contain subsidiary burials, possibly attendants or retainers, indicating early notions of posthumous hierarchy. The logic underlying these practices is consistent. Death was not the end but a continuation of existence requiring sustenance and order. This worldview anticipates the later Egyptian doctrine of the Ka, vital essence, and the Ba, personality, which necessitated ritual maintenance after death. Proto-textual evidence, though limited, reinforces this trajectory. Incised symbols on pottery and tags from Abydos, some of which precede formal hieroglyphs, display combinations of animals, standards, and enclosures. Scholars such as Gunter Dreyer interpret these markings as administrative or cultic identifiers rather than linguistic text, yet they reveal an emergent system of representation where sacred and bureaucratic functions began to merge. The use of visual signs to convey divine and political meaning marks the intellectual foundation of Egyptian hieroglyphic writing, itself a fusion of art, ritual, and authority. Two interpretive insights emerge from this period. First, the transition from animistic reverence to divine personification corresponds with the rise of social stratification. As communities grew in complexity, religion provided a framework for legitimizing leadership. The local ruler or chieftain became not merely a political figure but a mediator between humans and the divine order, a role that would mature into the pharaoh's sacral kingship. Second, the persistence of animal imagery demonstrates an enduring ecological consciousness. Spiritual power remained rooted in natural observation, binding religion to landscape even as political systems advanced. By the late Naqada III phase, circa 3200 to 3100 BCE, the convergence of these religious symbols, ritual institutions, and territorial identities created the ideological foundation for state formation. The falcon of Horus, the bull of strength, and the standards of local cults all coalesced into the iconography of kingship. The proto-religious cults of the pre-dynastic period thus represent not an isolated prelude but a structural precondition for Egypt's political unification. Unification turned these spirits into instruments of royal ideology. When Egypt became one land, it also became one cosmos ruled by a living god. Around 3100 BCE, Egypt underwent one of the most transformative events in world history: the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt into a single political and religious entity. This consolidation, traditionally attributed to King Narmer, was not merely a territorial conquest but the formalization of a cosmic order. Archaeological, textual, and iconographic evidence indicates that the creation of the Egyptian state coincided with the conceptual birth of divine kingship, a system in which political authority and cosmic balance were inseparable. From this moment onward, the ruler was not simply a monarch but the earthly embodiment of a god, the central mediator between humanity and the divine structure of the universe. The Narmer Palette, discovered at Hierakonpolis and dating to approximately 3100 BCE, remains the most important artifact illustrating this ideological transformation. On one face, Narmer wears the white crown of Upper Egypt. On the other, the red crown of Lower Egypt. Between these opposing symbols stands the falcon god Horus, restraining a papyrus-bound captive, an allegory for the subjugation of the Delta under divine sanction. This imagery transcends simple military triumph. The king's victory is presented as the restoration of Ma'at, the universal harmony that binds heaven, earth, and the afterlife. The political act of unification thus became a theological event, and the state itself a reflection of cosmic symmetry. Excavations at Abydos, where early rulers of the First Dynasty were buried, reinforce this dual structure of political and religious authority. The royal tombs at El-Quayab were constructed with subsidiary burials, offering deposits, and commemorative stelae bearing the earliest royal names enclosed within the Serek, a rectangular frame topped by the Horus falcon. The Serek represents not only the palace facade but also the concept of divine habitation. The king's name was literally inhabited by Horus. This system, known as the Horus name, identified the sovereign as the earthly manifestation of the sky god, affirming his divine essence. The tradition persisted through 3 millennia, underlying every royal titulary in Egyptian history. Interpretively, the Horus name signifies the institutionalization of theology as governance. The ruler did not merely claim divine favor, he was ontologically divine. His role was to maintain Ma'at through ritual, warfare, and administration, a duty simultaneously political and cosmological. In this sense, the early Egyptian state functioned as a temple polity, where spiritual order dictated bureaucratic structure. Archaeological remains from Abydos, Saqqara, and early Memphis reveal temples, shrines, and administrative complexes forming contiguous sacred precincts. Economic activity, record-keeping, and religious ceremony were integrated, reflecting a worldview in which human society operated as a microcosm of the divine universe. The earliest hieroglyphic inscriptions, found on seal impressions and ivory tags in royal tombs, provide further evidence of this synthesis. These inscriptions record the king's name, associated offerings, and the institutions responsible for provisioning the royal cult. Their dual function, administrative and ritual, exemplifies the Egyptian understanding of writing as both practical and sacred. According to later theological tradition, the god Thoth created writing as a means of preserving Ma'at across time. Even at this formative stage, the written word was inseparable from divine authority, serving as an instrument of cosmic perpetuation as much as of government. This intertwining of theology and kingship also reshaped the spatial organization of Egypt. The newly unified state required centralized administration, leading to the founding of Memphis near the apex of the delta. Ancient sources, including the Palermo stone and later Manethonian tradition, attribute this act to Menes, often equated with Narmer. Memphis was strategically positioned between Upper and Lower Egypt, symbolizing the balance between dualities, north and south, desert and floodplain, life and death. In the emerging religious lexicon, this equilibrium mirrored the balance of Ma'at itself. The king's court at Memphis became both political capital and ritual axis, a terrestrial counterpart to the divine realm. From an analytical perspective, the consolidation of divine kingship can be interpreted as a solution to the systemic challenges of state formation. As regional polities merged, a unifying ideology was required to legitimize hierarchy and prevent fragmentation. The God-King model provided an integrative framework that transcended local cults without erasing them. Under Narmer and his successors, regional deities were subsumed into a hierarchical pantheon under the authority of the royal Ka. Thus, theology became an instrument of political unification, and political unification a demonstration of theological truth. The First Dynasty, circa 3100 to 2900 BCE, institutionalized this model through ritual continuity. Annual ceremonies such as the said festival reaffirmed the king's vitality and divine legitimacy. Royal regalia, the crook and flail, the false beard, the double crown, expressed theological concepts of fertility, justice, and cosmic dominion. Each symbol was both an administrative tool and a metaphysical statement. Even warfare and taxation were interpreted through sacred logic. To conquer rebellion was to restore Ma'at. To collect grain was to ensure the gods' sustenance. Two interpretive insights clarify the significance of this transformation. First, Egypt's unification illustrates how religious cosmology functioned as a mechanism of statecraft, embedding political obedience within metaphysical necessity. Second, the rise of divine kingship redefined the human-divine relationship itself. The pharaoh stood not between mortals and gods as a priest, but as a living synthesis of both, his body mortal, his Ka eternal. This concept established one of the most enduring political theologies in human history. By the close of the First Dynasty, the ideological foundations of Egypt were complete. A single land under a single ruler, bound by ritual law and cosmic order. The Nile's geography had given rise to sacred symbols. Those symbols had given birth to gods, and the gods had found embodiment in the person of the king. With divine monarchy secure, the cosmos itself required explanation. The oldest written prayers in human history were not to gods, but to the sky itself. By the middle of the 3rd millennium BCE, Egypt had reached a level of political stability and administrative precision unmatched in the ancient world. Under the 5th and 6th dynasties, circa 2490 to 2180 BCE, the ideology of divine kingship achieved its most sophisticated expression, not through monumentality alone, but through theology. The pyramid texts, inscribed within the burial chambers of kings beginning with Unas at Saqqara around 2400 BCE, represent humanity's earliest known religious corpus. These inscriptions were not mythic narratives in the later literary sense but functional liturgies, a compendium of utterances designed to guide the deceased king's soul through the cosmos. Through their verses, the Egyptian conception of divine order, cosmic architecture, and eternal kingship found its earliest written form. The Pyramid of Unas, last ruler of the 5th dynasty, marks the beginning of this textual tradition. Over 700 individual spells, referred to by modern Egyptologists as utterances, were carved onto the limestone walls of his burial chambers. These texts, written in the archaic form of Old Egyptian, address the celestial journey of the king after death. They describe his transformation into an immortal being who ascends to the heavens to join the sun god Ra or to merge with the circumpolar stars, the imperishables that never set. The key purpose of these utterances was not poetic embellishment but metaphysical function, to ensure that the deceased monarch, identified with Horus in life and Osiris in death, could perpetuate Ma'at, the cosmic equilibrium that sustained both heaven and earth. Archaeological analysis of the Unas pyramid reveals deliberate spatial symbolism. The chamber ceilings are painted with stars, representing the sky into which the king would ascend, while the arrangement of corridors and shafts aligns with celestial orientations. Scholars such as James Allen and Alexander Piankov have emphasized that the text's content mirrors this architecture. The written spells act as a verbal counterpart to the pyramid's cosmic geometry. In Egyptian thought, word, image, and structure were inseparable. To carve sacred speech upon the tomb walls was to embed divine order into stone itself. Within the pyramid texts, several deities dominate the theological landscape. Ra, the solar creator, appears as the ultimate source of light and authority. Atum, often merged with Ra, represents the self-generated origin of all existence. The twin deities Shu and Tefnut, embodying air and moisture, personify the first separation of the elements, the beginning of ordered creation from primordial chaos. These divine figures form the foundation of the Heliopolitan cosmogony, centered at the solar cult city of Heliopolis. Yet within the royal tomb, they are not abstract forces but active participants in the king's transfiguration. One passage declares, "The sky has borne you with Ra, Atum has set you among the gods." Here, the monarch's apotheosis is depicted as both return and continuation, the restoration of cosmic order through his eternal union with creation itself. Interpretively, the pyramid texts mark a critical juncture in religious development, the transition from local cult ritual to systemic theology. Earlier, during the pre-dynastic and early dynastic periods, divinity was expressed through imagery and performance, falcons, bulls, or symbolic standards. In the Old Kingdom, divinity became textualized and abstracted. The written word assumed the same ontological power as the spoken ritual. This transformation suggests a maturing intellectual tradition, one capable of reflecting upon its own cosmological logic. The king's ascent was no longer portrayed solely as mythic reenactment but as a process governed by cosmic law, inscribed in both architecture and language. The texts also encode a subtle political message. Although they focus on the individual king's afterlife, their cosmology reinforces the permanence of kingship as an institution. Each utterance identifies the ruler as the living link between gods and men, ensuring that Ma'at continues beyond his death. In this sense, the pyramid texts operate as theological statecraft. They universalize the role of the monarch, presenting divine kingship as an eternal office within the structure of the universe itself. As long as the king ascends successfully, Egypt remains in balance. Notably, the texts show no sign of moral judgment in the later religious sense. The king's salvation is not earned but inherent, guaranteed by his status as the divine representative on earth. This feature distinguishes Old Kingdom theology from later developments such as the Book of the Dead. The cosmic order was self-sustaining. The pharaoh's ascension ensured its renewal. The people's role, in turn, was to maintain the physical and ritual structures, temples, offerings, festivals, that mirrored and supported this celestial process. Archaeological discoveries from subsequent pyramids, including those of Teti, Pepi I, and Pepi II, demonstrate that the tradition quickly standardized. Later inscriptions incorporate modifications and additions, suggesting active theological interpretation by priestly scribes. The consistency of the core material across generations indicates that these texts were drawn from a pre-existing oral and ritual corpus, codified for the first time in the royal tombs. Thus, the pyramid texts not only preserve Egypt's earliest written theology but also attest to a long-standing oral tradition of cosmic kingship dating back to the pre-dynastic period. Two interpretive insights underscore their broader significance. First, the pyramid texts illustrate how the Egyptians conceptualized the cosmos as a living, ordered totality, in which natural phenomena, the sun's path, the star's rotation, the Nile's flood, were all manifestations of divine structure. Second, the texts reveal the fusion of political and cosmic order. By ensuring the king's rebirth, the ritual language simultaneously guaranteed the world's continuity. This integration of theology, astronomy, and governance would remain the central paradigm of Egyptian civilization for the next 2 millennia. By 2400 BCE, the written word had become sacred architecture, the king a cosmic constant, and the pyramid a microcosm of the universe. The royal ascent described within its walls was not merely the journey of a soul, but the perpetual reaffirmation of a divine order that bound earth and sky, life and death, eternity and time. As royal theology matured, creation myths took regional form. 2 cities told 2 stories of creation. Both claimed to define the universe. During the height of the Old Kingdom, Egyptian religion reached a new level of intellectual articulation. The unification of Egypt had produced not only administrative and political centralization but also a diverse religious landscape in which regional priesthoods sought to express their own interpretations of cosmic origins. 2 of these centers, Heliopolis in Lower Egypt and Memphis near the apex of the Delta, developed theological systems that shaped Egyptian thought for more than 2,000 years. Each offered a complete vision of the universe, its beginning, structure, and divine mechanism, and each reflected the socio-political interests of its priesthood. The Heliopolitan Ennead and the Memphite theology together represent the earliest systematic philosophies of creation in recorded history. The Heliopolitan system, formulated by the priesthood of Ra and Adam, was rooted in solar cosmology. According to this theology, creation began when Adam, the self-generated one, emerged from the primeval waters of Nun. Standing upon the first mound, a metaphor for the initial emergence of land from the flood, Adam brought forth the twin deities Shu, air, and Tefnut, moisture, through an act of self-creation. From them descended Geb, earth, and Nut, sky, whose union produced Osiris, Isis, Seth, and Nephthys, forming the Ennead, or group of 9 gods. This lineage explained not only the structure of the cosmos but also the divine genealogy that underpinned kingship and moral order. The cyclical rebirth of the sun each morning symbolized the perpetual restoration of Ma'at, and the pharaoh, as the son of Ra, was its earthly guarantor. Archaeological and textual evidence for the Heliopolitan system appears in pyramid texts, royal inscriptions, and later theological treatises. The Ennead offered an elegant cosmology rooted in observable phenomena. The rising sun, the separation of sky and earth, and the cyclical renewal of life through the Nile's inundation. Yet its theological purpose was not purely cosmographic. It legitimized the supremacy of the solar cult, whose priests served at Heliopolis, one of Egypt's wealthiest temple complexes. During the 5th dynasty, pharaohs such as Userkaf and Sahur built solar temples dedicated to Ra, reflecting the city's growing political influence. The integration of the king into the solar order, through titles like Sa-Ra, son of Ra, reveals how theology functioned as political ideology. The cosmos in this model was a royal hierarchy in divine form. In contrast, the Memphite theology, associated with the god Ta, offered a radically different interpretation of creation. Preserved most completely on the Shabaka stone, a granite slab inscribed during the 25th dynasty but citing much older traditions, the Memphite system describes creation as an act of intellectual and linguistic conception. Ta, the craftsman god of Memphis, creates the world not through physical generation but through thought and speech. It was through the heart and through the tongue that Ta gave birth to the gods. The text declares, the heart, IB, represents mind or intention, while the tongue, Nes, symbolizes articulation, together embodying an early philosophy of logos, the idea that existence is realized through ordered consciousness. This theological formulation reveals the worldview of Memphis, Egypt's administrative and artistic center. As a city of craftsmen, scribes, and engineers, Memphis naturally conceived of creation as a process of design and execution. Ta's creative speech mirrored the precision of artisans shaping matter through concept and command. The Memphite priests thus positioned their god above all others. Adam and the Ennead, they argued, were conceived first in Ta's mind before being spoken into being. This intellectualization of divinity, creation as mental and verbal articulation, marks one of the earliest known expressions of metaphysical abstraction in human thought. Interpretively, The theological divergence between Heliopolis and Memphis reflects more than doctrinal variance. It represents competing epistemologies. Heliopolitan theology explains the cosmos as organic emergence, a natural, biological unfolding from the primeval waters, whereas Memphite theology interprets creation as conceptual order, imposed by divine intellect. Both models articulate Ma'at, but from different vantage points. One cosmic and genealogical, the other structural and philosophical. These two frameworks would later coexist rather than conflict, illustrating the Egyptian capacity for theological synthesis. The rivalry between the Heliopolitan and Memphite priesthoods also had political implications. The priests of Heliopolis aligned themselves with the solar kings of the 5th dynasty, whose legitimacy rested upon descent from Ra. The Memphite clergy, serving the capital's administrative elite, emphasized intellectual and technical mastery as divine attributes. In practice, both systems reinforced the same hierarchy, divine kingship as the center of cosmic order. Yet they appealed to distinct constituencies within the state. Theology, in this sense, became a language of institutional identity. Archaeological data corroborates the prominence of both centers. Excavations at Heliopolis reveal vast temple complexes aligned with solar orientations, while remains at Memphis include workshops, shrines, and the colossal statues of Ptah. The integration of theology with urban design is significant. Cities themselves became embodiments of cosmic principles. Heliopolis mirrored the cycle of the sun. Memphis embodied the creative intellect that organized the material world. This spatial theology reflects the Egyptian view of religion not as abstract belief but as lived architecture, the cosmos materialized through human construction. Two interpretive insights clarify the intellectual significance of these systems. First, the coexistence of the Ennead and the Memphite theology demonstrates that Egyptian religion was pluralistic yet coherent, capable of accommodating divergent cosmologies within a single framework of Ma'at. Rather than seeking dogmatic exclusivity, each theology articulated a different aspect of divine function, creation as life and creation as mind. Second, the Memphite emphasis on creation through speech anticipates a broader linguistic philosophy evident throughout Egyptian religious texts. Words themselves were thought to possess ontological power. To name was to cause to exist. This principle would later govern ritual recitations, funerary spells, and the very logic of hieroglyphic writing. By the end of the Old Kingdom, both Heliopolitan and Memphite theologies had become institutional pillars of the Egyptian worldview. The sun god Ra and the craftsman god Ptah stood at the apex of a unified yet multifaceted pantheon, their doctrines shaping royal ideology, temple liturgy, and philosophical speculation for centuries. The cosmos had been described not once, but twice, through the dual lenses of vitality and intellect, emergence and articulation. But when kingship weakened, salvation turned inward. To keep the sun rising, the king had to die as a god. By the middle of the Old Kingdom, Egypt's theology had reached its political culmination. The pharaoh was no longer merely a ruler. He was the indispensable link between heaven and earth, the divine mediator whose existence ensured the continuity of creation itself. This conception did not arise suddenly. It evolved from the earlier fusion of the Horus King tradition, rooted in predynastic symbology, and the later solar theology of Ra that had gained ascendancy under the 5th dynasty. The union of these ideas produced a new metaphysical construct. The king is Horus in life and Ra in essence, whose death and rebirth sustained the eternal rhythm of the cosmos. The pyramid texts, inscribed in the royal tombs of Unas, Teti, and Pepi I at Saqqara, provide the clearest evidence of this doctrine. These texts do not describe the afterlife of a private individual but the transfiguration of the monarch into a celestial being. In these utterances, the king ascends to the sky, unites with the sun, and joins the company of the gods. The language is formulaic and ritualized, reflecting the belief that cosmic order, Ma'at, depended upon the successful transformation of the royal body into divine permanence. The sky is clear, the star gods appear. One inscription proclaims, "The king rises as a god, as the morning star." The pharaoh's death was therefore not an end but a renewal of universal stability. Archaeological and architectural evidence supports this cosmological vision. The 5th dynasty solar temples at Abu Ghurab, particularly those of kings Userkaf and Nusair, were constructed to manifest the king's role in the solar cycle. These open-air sanctuaries featured an obelisk-like structure symbolizing the sun's rays, surrounded by ritual courts used for daily offerings to Ra. The pharaoh was represented as both the priest and the recipient of these rites, embodying the circular exchange between human and divine. Through this architecture, theology became visible. The temple itself was the horizon where the divine sun met the earthly king. Interpretively, this integration of kingship and solar worship demonstrates how religion functioned as the ideological infrastructure of governance. The pharaoh's duty was not merely to rule the land but to preserve the balance of the cosmos. Administrative acts, irrigation management, taxation, the enforcement of justice were framed as extensions of cosmic maintenance. To maintain Ma'at on earth was to sustain the divine order in heaven. Consequently, rebellion or neglect was not only political disobedience but cosmic disruption. The state itself became a theological mechanism for cosmic equilibrium. During this period, another theological development deepened the king's divine identity: the integration of Osiris into the royal cult. Originally a local deity of fertility and vegetation from Abydos, Osiris gradually became associated with the afterlife and resurrection. By the reign of Unas, circa 2350 BCE, the pyramid texts refer to the king as one who joins the imperishable stars and becomes Osiris Unas. This identification marked a critical shift in Egyptian eschatology. The pharaoh was now both solar and chthonic, embodying life in the sky as Ra and death in the earth as Osiris. The mythic cycle of death and rebirth, mirrored in the agricultural and solar rhythms, was personalized in the king's own destiny. The fusion of Ra and Osiris established a dual theology of continuity and renewal. In the day, the sun god Ra ruled the heavens. At night, he journeyed through the underworld as Osiris, only to be reborn at dawn. The pharaoh, by uniting with both deities, became the eternal mediator, ensuring that this transition between day and night, life and death, order and chaos, never ceased. This conceptualization gave Egypt's monarchy its distinctive theological depth. Kingship was both temporal administration and cosmic necessity. Without the king's ritual death and rebirth, the cosmos itself would falter. Two interpretive insights clarify the broader implications of this theology. First, the identification of the king with divine processes institutionalized cyclical sovereignty, a system in which power was defined not by lineage alone but by participation in cosmic renewal. This idea provided continuity across dynastic successions, legitimizing each ruler as a manifestation of the same eternal principle. Second, the Osirian integration foreshadowed the democratization of the afterlife that would follow in later periods. By establishing the king as an Osirian figure, the theological groundwork was laid for extending similar hopes of resurrection to common Egyptians once royal exclusivity weakened. The funerary architecture of the period reinforces these theological developments. The royal pyramid complex was conceived as a microcosm of creation. The pyramid's orientation toward the cardinal points symbolized order. Its form represented the primeval mound rising from chaos. The adjoining mortuary temples housed daily rituals that maintained communication between the living priests and the divine king. In this way, the king's tomb became an active cult center, a perpetual institution sustaining Ma'at beyond the monarch's lifetime. Archaeologists have found abundant offering lists, priestly installations, and administrative papyri attesting to the economic scale of these royal cults. The king's divinity was therefore not a matter of belief alone but of organized practice, embedded in the functioning of the state. According to the Westcar Papyrus, composed in the Middle Kingdom but reflecting older traditions, even the birth of a pharaoh was framed as divine intervention. The narrative describes how the sun god Ra orchestrated the births of the first kings of the 5th dynasty. Such tales retrospectively sacralized the monarchy, reinforcing the notion that kingship itself was an eternal office bestowed by the gods. Texts, temples, and rituals converged to affirm a single truth. The pharaoh's life was the mechanism by which the cosmos endured. By the close of the Old Kingdom, however, this system began to strain. The resources required to maintain royal cults and massive pyramid projects depleted central authority, while provincial governors, nomarchs, accumulated independent power. As royal control weakened, so too did the monopoly of divine mediation. The cosmic function once embodied in the pharaoh began to diffuse into local and personal religion. As royal authority collapsed, common Egyptians sought divine protection for themselves. When kings fell silent, the provinces spoke with 1,000 gods. The collapse of central authority at the end of the Old Kingdom, around 2180 BCE, marked not merely a political disintegration but a profound religious decentralization. The ideology that had once placed the pharaoh at the cosmic center fractured as regional lords and local priesthoods assumed control of ritual life. Where once the king alone had mediated between heaven and earth, now dozens of provincial centers, the nomes, developed their own forms of worship, myth, and temple economy. Archaeological and textual evidence from this period shows that Egyptian religion did not decline but diversified, adapting to the realities of fragmented rule. In Upper Egypt, Thebes emerged as a regional power under the local rulers of the 11th dynasty's predecessors. Here, the god Montu, a falcon-headed warrior deity, gained prominence as a patron of martial strength and local sovereignty. His temples at Armant and Medamud reflect a theology oriented toward divine kingship in miniature. Each provincial ruler acted as Montu's representative within his own territory. Meanwhile, in Elephantine, the ram-headed Khnum, creator of life upon his potter's wheel, embodied fertility and regeneration, reflecting the economic importance of Nile inundations in this southern frontier. Excavations on Elephantine Island reveal temple foundations dating to this era, demonstrating the persistence of organized cult activity even amid political fragmentation. These developments represent an early form of religious pluralism within a unified cosmological framework. Despite regional variation, the core concept of Ma'at, the ordered balance of the universe, remained intact. Each local deity was conceived not as rival to others but as the expression of divine order within a specific domain. Administrative inscriptions from Sayet, Coptos, and Abydos indicate that nomarchs maintained priestly staffs and endowments, modeling their institutions on royal precedents. The temple economy, once centralized in Memphis and Heliopolis, thus became provincialized, anchoring local identities while preserving continuity with national religious tradition. Interpretively, this shift from royal to local cults illustrates how religion functioned as a stabilizing mechanism in times of political collapse. The loss of pharaonic unity did not lead to theological chaos but to a reallocation of sacred authority. As provincial elites assumed ritual responsibilities, religious practice became the means through which local governance legitimized itself. Temples operated as centers of social cohesion, redistributing grain and managing labor during the Nile's annual cycles. Through these institutions, communities maintained continuity of belief even in the absence of a functioning central state. Archaeological data from Tomb 12 at Sayet, belonging to the Nomarch Jephi, exemplify this synthesis of politics and religion. Inscriptions praise the deceased for preserving the offerings to the gods and the rites of the temples, language that once applied only to kings. This linguistic transfer demonstrates how divine stewardship became democratized. Maintaining Ma'at was no longer the pharaoh's exclusive duty, but the responsibility of every local ruler. Such evidence underscores that Egypt's resilience lay in its capacity to translate theological structures into regional frameworks. At the same time, religious expression acquired a more personal and moral dimension. Funerary stelae and coffin texts from this era begin to emphasize individual piety, ethical conduct, and divine judgment, themes previously confined to royal ideology. Texts such as the Instruction for Merakare, likely composed during the 10th dynasty, urge rulers to act with justice and compassion, reflecting the notion that moral order itself sustained cosmic balance. This moralization of religion, emerging from the instability of the period, marked a turning point in Egyptian spirituality. The multiplication of deities and regional theologies did not erase older traditions. Rather, it prepared the intellectual ground for synthesis. In this religiously fragmented landscape, older solar and Osirian ideas continued to circulate, gradually merging into a theology that addressed both life and death, chaos and restoration. The fragmentation of cults thus acted as an incubator for theological innovation. Out of localized devotion would arise the concept of universal salvation, embodied in the figure of Osiris, whose myth of death and resurrection resonated across provincial boundaries. This process can be interpreted as a structural response to crisis. When central institutions collapse, religious systems tend to adapt by emphasizing accessibility and personal participation. In Egypt's case, the weakening of the pharaoh's cosmic role allowed for the diffusion of divine mediation to every level of society. The same inscriptions that once proclaimed the king's journey to the stars now appeared in private tombs, extending the promise of eternal life beyond the royal sphere. This theological democratization began here, in the uncertain years when local gods replaced a silent throne. By around 2055 BCE, Theban rulers under Mentuhotep II began to reunify Egypt, drawing on this pluralistic religious landscape to construct a new ideological order. The unifying principle would no longer be the living sun king of the Old Kingdom, but a resurrected god who offered renewal to all Egyptians, Osiris of Abydos. Out of chaos rose a god who promised rebirth for all. When kings fell, gods became merciful. The reunification of Egypt under Mentuhotep II around 2055 BCE did more than restore political order. It redefined the very structure of Egyptian religion. The Middle Kingdom introduced a theological transformation often described as the Osirian Revolution. Where Old Kingdom faith had centered on the exclusive divinity of kings, the Middle Kingdom recast that divinity as a universal promise. Immortality, once the privilege of the pharaoh, was now extended to every Egyptian who lived in accordance with moral and ritual order. At the heart of this transformation stood Osiris, lord of the underworld, whose myth of death and resurrection became the moral axis of Egyptian spirituality. The coffin texts, a vast corpus of funerary spells inscribed within wooden coffins, provide the clearest evidence of this shift. Dating from the late First Intermediate period into the 12th dynasty, circa 2100 to 1800 BCE. These texts adapted the royal pyramid texts for non-royal use. The deceased was now addressed not as a king ascending to join the gods, but as a moral individual seeking justification before the divine tribunal of Osiris. Phrases such as, "I am Osiris, Lord of Eternity," and "My soul is pure, my heart is righteous," reveal a democratization of salvation. Archaeologists have recovered such inscriptions from Beni Hassan, Asiut, and Deir el-Bersha, confirming their wide diffusion among provincial elites. Interpretively, the coffin texts represent a profound theological shift. The afterlife was no longer achieved through royal identity, but through moral alignment with divine justice. Osiris, murdered and resurrected through the devotion of Isis, became the archetype of every Egyptian who faced death. His triumph over dismemberment mirrored the triumph of order over chaos, and his resurrection guaranteed that renewal was possible for all. In this way, Osiris replaced the solar monarch as the moral center of the cosmos. The king remained divine, but now he was first among equals in the universal cycle of death and rebirth. At Abydos, the ancient cult center of Osiris, these new ideas took physical form. Excavations at the Temple of Seti I and the Osirian, though later rebuilt in the New Kingdom, reveal an enduring tradition of pilgrimage dating back to the Middle Kingdom. Stelae of private individuals, found throughout the site, record visits to the shrine of Osiris and petitions for eternal life. One inscription reads, "May I see the god in his procession, may I breathe the sweet north wind of the Lord of Abydos." This evidence indicates that participation in Osiris's mystery was not confined to priests or nobles. It had become a national act of devotion, linking moral conduct in life to eternal reward in death. The political context of the Middle Kingdom helped institutionalize this theology. Kings such as Senusret I and Amenemhat III patronized Osirian cults to reinforce unity after centuries of division. By promoting a god whose reach transcended region and class, the monarchy effectively reasserted ideological cohesion. Temples at Abydos, Osiris, and Akhmim received royal endowments, and local priesthoods incorporated Osirian hymns into funerary liturgies. The strategic alignment of theology and statecraft demonstrates how religion could serve as a tool of integration, uniting Egypt not only through administration but through shared faith. Two interpretive insights emerge from this transformation. First, the Osirian myth provided a moral framework that redefined cosmic order. In the Old Kingdom, Ma'at had meant the maintenance of balance through obedience to the king. In the Middle Kingdom, it evolved into an ethical principle binding both gods and humans. Texts such as the Instructions of Amenemhat and the Tale of the Eloquent Peasant depict justice, compassion, and truthfulness as divine expectations rather than political virtues. The cosmos, once upheld by royal ritual, was now sustained by moral conduct. Every individual's actions contributed to the stability of Ma'at. Second, the Osirian theology introduced the concept of personal judgment after death, prefiguring the weighing of the heart seen later formalized in the Book of the Dead. Spell 30b of the coffin texts reads, "My heart is mine in my chest, it shall not rise against me in the judgment." This anticipation of ethical reckoning transformed Egyptian religion from a ritual mechanism into a moral philosophy. The underworld became not only a place of transformation but of accountability, a mirror of earthly justice projected onto eternity. Archaeological findings corroborate this broader accessibility of the afterlife. Non-royal tombs of the Middle Kingdom, such as those at Beni Hassan and El Bersha, exhibit elaborate wall paintings and inscriptions invoking Osiris and Anubis. The inclusion of miniature offering tables, Shabti figurines, and amulets indicates that funerary equipment once restricted to royalty had become widespread. These material expressions confirm that belief in individual salvation had penetrated all levels of Egyptian society. The Osirian Revolution, therefore, was not merely theological but social, dissolving the barrier between royal and common afterlives. This democratization of immortality had lasting effects on Egyptian identity. It encouraged personal piety and ethical reflection, producing literature that emphasized the relationship between human action and divine order. The Harper's songs, often inscribed in tombs, urged the living to enjoy life yet remain mindful of moral duty, a balance between joy and justice rooted in Osirian thought. The universality of Osiris's promise rendered Egyptian religion both more inclusive and more introspective. By the close of the Middle Kingdom, Egypt's spiritual landscape had been permanently transformed. The pharaoh was no longer the solitary guarantor of the cosmos. He was the exemplar of a moral ideal available to all. The Osirian Revolution replaced the cosmic hierarchy of the Old Kingdom with a moral cosmos, governed by justice, mercy, and rebirth. Moral order demanded a cosmic principle, Ma'at. For the first time, eternity required conscience. By the height of the Middle Kingdom, circa 1975 to 1650 BCE, Egyptian religion had undergone a transformation unprecedented in its moral sophistication. Death was no longer a mechanical transition secured through royal status or priestly ritual. It had become a moral event, determined by the individual's conduct in life. The cosmos, previously maintained by the pharaoh's ritual power, was now imagined as governed by an ethical equilibrium, a divine justice embodied in the goddess Ma'at. This development marked the birth of what scholars often call the ethical turn in Egyptian religion. The belief that salvation depended on virtue, truth, and personal integrity. The evidence for this transformation appears most vividly in the coffin texts and their descendants in the Book of the Dead, where the deceased faces a judgment before Osiris and a panel of divine assessors. The earliest forms of the weighing of the heart motif can be traced to these Middle Kingdom sources. Here, the heart, IB, understood as the seat of thought, memory, and moral awareness, was placed upon a balance opposite the feather of Ma'at. The result determined one's fate in the afterlife. Unlike earlier conceptions that emphasized royal transformation or magical utterance, This judgment scene required ethical justification. One's eternal destiny was now contingent upon moral truth rather than social rank. In these texts, the god Thoth, scribe of the gods, assumed a crucial role as divine recorder. Standing beside the scales, he noted the outcome of the weighing and affirmed the justice of the verdict. His presence introduced the concept of divine record-keeping, the idea that moral behavior left an indelible mark upon the universe. Inscriptions describe Thoth as he who counts the hearts and knows the truth of all deeds, framing the afterlife as a continuation of moral law rather than an escape from it. This innovation effectively universalized cosmic accountability. Divine order was no longer maintained through sacrifice or ritual alone, but through the collective moral conduct of humanity. The emergence of this judgment scene represents a profound internalization of religion. Archaeological evidence from Middle Kingdom tombs, such as those at Beni Hassan and Meir, displays an increasing emphasis on autobiographical inscriptions. These texts often begin with formulas like, "I gave bread to the hungry, water to the thirsty, clothing to the naked." Such declarations were not boasts of charity but moral testimonies, written to affirm the deceased's conformity with Ma'at. They transformed tomb walls into ethical ledgers, recording lives lived in harmony with cosmic truth. In the absence of a centralized monarchy, morality became the new instrument of cosmic order. Two interpretive insights clarify the significance of this moralization. First, it reflects the democratization of divine judgment. The afterlife became a universal arena in which every person, regardless of status, confronted the same ethical evaluation. This shift parallels the social stabilization of the Middle Kingdom, where a strong central government under the 12th dynasty re-established order while affirming the dignity of local and private devotion. Second, the moralization of the afterlife reveals the Egyptian conception of justice as reciprocity, a balanced exchange between individual behavior and cosmic consequence. Good conduct sustained Ma'at. Wrongdoing disrupted it, demanding correction in this life or the next. In material culture, this ethical framework appears in funerary art and religious manuscripts. The earliest judgment tableaus, precursors to the famous scenes of the Book of the Dead, such as Spell 125, depict Osiris enthroned within a hall of truth, attended by 42 assessor deities, each representing a moral principle or geographic region of Egypt. This structure symbolized the unity of ethical and national order. Every nome, every moral law, contributed to the maintenance of Ma'at. The deceased, standing before the tribunal, recited the negative confession, a declaration of innocence covering crimes from theft and murder to deceit and sacrilege. Through speech, the individual re-established harmony between self and cosmos. From a theological perspective, this moralization of the afterlife signals the completion of the Osirian revolution. Osiris's resurrection had already universalized the promise of immortality. The concept of moral judgment now universalized responsibility. Eternal life could be granted to all, but only if the heart remained light, a metaphor for truthfulness and integrity. This redefinition of salvation transformed Egyptian religion from a system of divine hierarchy into one of moral reciprocity. Archaeological finds from Deir el-Bersha and El-Lahan reinforce this interpretation. Coffins and papyri from these sites include detailed vignettes of judgment scenes alongside prayers to Osiris and Ma'at. The presence of these texts in non-royal burials indicates that moral consciousness had become embedded in everyday piety. Ethical self-scrutiny, once the concern of kings and sages, had become a universal religious obligation. By the end of the Middle Kingdom, Egypt's vision of eternity was firmly grounded in conscience and justice. The cosmos no longer revolved solely around divine monarchy, but around the moral equilibrium sustained by every soul. Eternal life was both a right and a responsibility, earned through adherence to Ma'at, witnessed by Thoth, and judged by Osiris. Regional cults expanded, reflecting Egypt's growing complexity. The hidden god became the ruler of the world. The political reunification of Egypt following the Second Intermediate Period established Thebes as the epicenter of both state and religious authority. During the early 18th dynasty, circa 1550 to 1292 BCE, The god Ammonius, previously a local deity of Thebes, rose to unprecedented prominence, ultimately becoming a national and imperial god. This ascent reflected both the political centrality of Thebes and the intellectual capacity of Egyptian theology to integrate and elevate regional deities. Ammonius' rise illustrates how religion and statecraft intertwined. As the Theban kings consolidated power, their patron deity became a tool of ideological unification and imperial legitimacy. Archaeological evidence from Karnak Temple, located on the east bank of the Nile, documents the monumentalization of Ammonius' cult. The site, expanded over centuries, became the largest religious complex in Egypt, its successive pylons, hypostyle halls, and obelisks reflecting both architectural ingenuity and the theological assertion of divine kingship. Inscriptions describe Ammonius as hidden, mysterious, and self-generated, a deity whose concealment paradoxically emphasized omnipotence. By the reign of Thutmose III, Ammonius was formally syncretized with Ra, creating the composite deity Ammonius Ra, whose solar and hidden aspects reinforced the king's legitimacy as both earthly and cosmic ruler. This theological synthesis also aligned the god's powers with the natural cycles of the sun, the flood, and the celestial order, extending Ammonius Ra's relevance from local Thebes to the entirety of Egypt. The cult of Ammonius was not only textual and architectural but deeply ritualized. The annual Opet festival, celebrated along the Nile between Karnak and Luxor, exemplified the integration of deity, king, and populace. During this festival, statues of Ammonius, Mut, and Khonsu were transported in ceremonial boats, symbolizing the renewal of divine authority and the cosmic order. Priests performed rites to maintain Ma'at, while the pharaoh participated directly, reinforcing his role as mediator between God and people. Inscriptions and reliefs emphasize the king's symbolic rebirth through union with Ammonius Ra during these ceremonies, visually linking human and divine governance. Interpretively, Ammonius' rise reflects a broader mechanism of ideological centralization. By elevating a local god to imperial status, Theban rulers transformed regional religious loyalty into national cohesion. Ammonius' hidden and mysterious nature allowed for flexible theological interpretation. He could embody the creative force, solar power, or political authority as needed. This adaptability strengthened the monarchy's ability to unify diverse nomes under one religious and political framework. In essence, Theban supremacy was both physical, through temples, festivals, and monuments, and metaphysical, expressed in the god's omnipresent yet concealed authority. Two lines of evidence illustrate the breadth of this transformation. First, monumental inscriptions, such as those on the obelisks of Hatshepsut, declare that Ammonius is king of the gods and ruler of all lands, linking divine supremacy with territorial expansion. Second, economic records indicate the vast wealth concentrated in the temple of Ammonius at Karnak, which controlled agricultural estates, workshops, and labor forces. This economic centralization mirrored political authority, reinforcing Ammonius' position as a god whose power was inseparable from earthly administration. The interplay of ritual, economy, and politics exemplifies how theology functioned as a pillar of imperial governance. The king's role within Ammonius' cult remained central. In texts and reliefs, the pharaoh is portrayed as the god's chosen representative, whose military victories and administrative actions reflected divine will. The syncretism of Ammonius and Ra further reinforced the king's dual role as temporal and cosmic mediator. By embodying the god's creative and solar aspects, the pharaoh became both executor of policy and guarantor of universal order. In this model, imperial expansion, campaigns in Nubia, the Levant, and Syria, was framed not as conquest alone but as a ritual affirmation of cosmic hierarchy, extending Ma'at into foreign lands under Ammonius' divine sanction. Interpretively, the rise of Ammonius also illustrates the political efficacy of theological flexibility. Unlike earlier deities such as Ra or Ta, whose domains were more narrowly defined, Ammonius' hidden nature allowed him to be co-opted for multiple purposes: moral authority, solar power, and imperial sponsorship. His cult became the ideological backbone of the new kingdom state, demonstrating how Egyptian religion could adapt to changing political realities without losing continuity with tradition. By the reign of Amenhotep III, Ammonius-Array's supremacy had reached its apex. Massive statues, elaborately decorated obelisks, and lavish offerings attest to the integration of religion, kingship, and empire. This elevation of a formerly local deity illustrates a recurring pattern in Egyptian history: the mutual reinforcement of political power and divine status, in which state authority elevates the god, and the god, in turn, legitimizes the state. But a visionary pharaoh would challenge this divine hierarchy. For 17 years, Egypt worshipped the sun alone. The mid-18th dynasty witnessed one of the most radical religious experiments in Egyptian history: the Eight-Nist Revolution, instigated by Pharaoh Akhenaten, circa 1353 to 1336 BCE. Departing from the entrenched supremacy of Ammonius-Array, Akhenaten elevated the solar disk, Aten, to the position of Egypt's sole deity. This unprecedented shift was both theological and political, redefining the relationship between king, deity, and society. It simultaneously centralized religious authority in the pharaoh and sought to redirect the devotion of priests, administrators, and citizens toward a single, abstract divine principle. The reform's origins were deeply entwined with Theban political structures. By the early reign of Akhenaten, the priesthood of Ammonius had accrued vast economic and political influence, controlling estates, labor, and temple revenues. Historians and Egyptologists have argued that Akhenaten's devotion to Aten may have been motivated partly by a desire to undermine Ammonius' power, consolidating religious authority exclusively under the monarchy. Unlike Ammonius, whose hidden, syncretic nature allowed flexibility, Aten was represented visually as a sun disk emitting rays terminating in hands, emphasizing direct divine interaction with the pharaoh. Akhenaten established a new capital at Akhetaten, modern Amarna, deliberately distancing the court from Theban priestly influence. Architectural and archaeological evidence reveals that temples to Aten were open-air structures, lacking the dark sanctuaries and complex cult hierarchies typical of earlier temple systems. This design reflected theological innovation. Worship of Aten was immediate, unmediated by priestly intermediaries, and oriented toward the visual and physical presence of the sun. Daily rituals emphasized light, nourishment, and royal participation, reinforcing the pharaoh's role as both priest and sole conduit of divine grace. Parallel to architectural change, Akhenaten revolutionized artistic conventions. Representations of the royal family became highly naturalistic and elongated, depicting intimate domestic scenes rather than traditional divine idealization. Reliefs show Akhenaten and Queen Nefertiti offering to Aten, with rays ending in hands extending life and sustenance to the royal family. The focus on the king's direct reception of divine blessing reinforced theological centralization. The pharaoh alone mediated the relationship between Aten and humanity, merging political and spiritual authority. The great hymn to the Aten, preserved in tombs at Amarna, encapsulates the theological core of the reform. Aten is praised as the creator and sustainer of life, providing for all creatures through sunlight and warmth. Unlike prior polytheistic liturgies, the hymn emphasizes universal beneficence, depicting a god concerned with daily sustenance rather than ritual hierarchy. This text reflects both a philosophical abstraction of divinity and a practical mechanism for legitimizing the pharaoh's unique position. Akhenaten alone could receive and interpret Aten's blessings. Interpretively, the Eight-Nist Revolution demonstrates the intersection of religion and statecraft in radical form. By suppressing the traditional priesthood of Ammonius and redirecting devotion to Aten, Akhenaten centralized both spiritual and temporal power. The reforms redefined divine authority as inseparable from the king, highlighting a model of theocratic governance distinct from previous Egyptian traditions, where gods exercised authority indirectly through priestly institutions. It also represents one of the earliest examples of monotheistic or monolatristic ideology in recorded history, with Aten serving as the singular active cosmic principle. Archaeological evidence confirms both the scale and intensity of the reform. Excavations at Amarna reveal extensive temple complexes, royal tombs, and administrative quarters, demonstrating that Aten worship was not confined to elite rhetoric but permeated urban planning, civic infrastructure, and ritual economy. Inscriptions and reliefs show the systematic removal or erasure of Ammonius' name in temples across Egypt, reflecting both religious zeal and political enforcement. The Atenist period thus represents a comprehensive transformation of both theological conception and institutional practice. However, Akhenaten's innovations were ultimately short-lived. Following his death, traditional religious institutions were restored. Tutankhaten, later renamed Tutankhamun, abandoned Akhetaten and returned the capital to Thebes, reinstating Ammonius Ra as the central deity. Textual and archaeological evidence indicates that many Amarna-era monuments were dismantled or defaced, and the Atenist cult was systematically suppressed. This abrupt reversal highlights the limits of radical religious centralization in a society where polytheistic practice and priestly power were deeply entrenched. Two interpretive insights clarify the broader significance of the Atenist revolution. First, it demonstrates how theology could be mobilized to enforce political authority, illustrating the Egyptian model in which religious innovation served governance as much as spiritual purpose. Second, it shows the flexibility and resilience of Egyptian religion. Even a near-monotheistic innovation, imposed by a charismatic ruler, could be absorbed, suppressed, or redirected within the existing cosmological framework, without fundamentally destabilizing the continuity of belief. The enduring veneration of Ra and later integration of solar theology in New Kingdom ritual indicates that Akhenaten's experiment, though brief, influenced theological discourse and artistic convention for centuries. By the end of the Amarna period, Egypt had experienced a rare interruption in its pantheon, one in which the sun alone was worshipped, the pharaoh alone mediated the divine, and artistic and ritual norms were radically reimagined. The experiment lasted 17 years, a brief but profound interlude in Egypt's continuous religious evolution. With his death, the sun set on heresy, and the old gods returned. Out of heresy came intimacy, a new closeness to the divine. The death of Akhenaten and the restoration of traditional religious institutions marked not merely a return to the old pantheon, but the emergence of a more personal and participatory form of piety. Tutankhamun, I, and Horemheb oversaw the reinstatement of Ammonius Ra, Osiris, and other principal deities, systematically repairing the temples of Thebes and re-sanctifying ritual spaces. Inscriptions and building projects from the late 18th dynasty attest to a deliberate effort to reassert cosmic order, Ma'at, while simultaneously accommodating the spiritual needs of ordinary Egyptians. This recovery period illustrates the adaptive capacity of Egyptian religion. Centralized cults regained prominence, but the populace increasingly engaged directly with divine forces beyond the pharaoh's mediation. Evidence from personal prayer stelae and household shrines demonstrates the flourishing of intimate devotion. These small, often inscribed objects were placed in domestic spaces, depicting deities alongside the names of the worshippers. Figures of Bes, the protective dwarf god, and Tauret, the hippopotamus goddess of fertility and childbirth, became widely popular, particularly among women and children. Archaeological finds from domestic sites in Thebes, Deir el-Medina, and Amarna reveal that households invested in miniature statues, amulets, and votive offerings, reflecting a direct, personal relationship with divine powers. Unlike monumental temple cults, these objects were portable and individualized, suggesting that religious experience had shifted from exclusively state-centered ritual to everyday life and domestic practice. Theological interpretation supports this view. The return to polytheism was coupled with the expansion of the divine portfolio to meet human needs. Bes and Tauret, once peripheral, became essential mediators in matters of health, protection, and fertility. Their presence in homes, often represented on walls or painted on furniture, indicates that divine attention was now accessible without elaborate temple ceremonies. Similarly, minor deities such as Hapi, god of the Nile inundation, and Soker, funerary god, were invoked for localized or seasonal concerns. This proliferation of accessible divinity reflects a broader social democratization of faith. Egyptians no longer required a pharaoh or a priestly hierarchy to secure divine favor in daily affairs. Interpretively, The post-Amarna period shows that religious innovation can yield long-term cultural adaptation, even when formally rejected. Although the Atenist experiment was politically suppressed, its emphasis on direct, visual, and personalized interaction with the deity influenced subsequent religious practice. Open-air worship, simplified ritual gestures, and domestic icons all reflect a subtle continuity with Amarna ideals, now integrated into traditional theology. This synthesis created a dual religious model. Monumental temples maintained cosmic and political order, while household devotion allowed for intimate, participatory spirituality. The proliferation of textual sources also illustrates the shift toward personal accountability and ethical engagement. Middle and late New Kingdom tombs, for example, include autobiographical inscriptions in which the deceased asserts moral conduct, benevolence, and devotion to household and community gods. These narratives echo earlier coffin texts and Osirian principles but are framed in everyday ethical terms. Ordinary Egyptians began to see morality, ritual observance, and divine favor as inseparable, reinforcing the notion that faith and ethical conduct were individual responsibilities rather than exclusively royal or priestly prerogatives. Pilgrimage continued to play a role, but its focus increasingly combined communal and personal devotion. Sites such as Abydos, sacred to Osiris, attracted visitors who inscribed their names and offerings on stelae, praying for protection, fertility, or afterlife security. These inscriptions reflect a shift from collective ritual to individualized petition, creating a tangible record of popular engagement with divine forces. Similarly, the mortuary temples of Deir el-Medina, where artisans and workers of royal tombs lived, show evidence of local festivals, offerings, and miniature chapels, indicating that even state-employed populations cultivated their own spiritual networks. The economic and material aspects of post-Amarna piety also highlight its accessibility. Small votive objects, figurines, amulets, painted tiles, were relatively inexpensive and widely distributed. Archaeological recovery in sites like Tombos, Akhmim, and El Kab demonstrates that these devotional items were used in ordinary households, not solely in elite or temple contexts. Such artifacts reveal the extension of religious practice beyond the elite, suggesting that the New Kingdom facilitated both large-scale theological authority and intimate domestic engagement. Two interpretive insights illuminate the period's significance. First, the post-Amarna recovery demonstrates religion's dual function as both stabilizer and personal support system. Centralized temples reaffirmed cosmic order and political legitimacy, while household gods addressed individual concerns, providing comfort and protection in everyday life. Second, this period shows the resilience and adaptability of Egyptian religion. Even after radical disruption, the traditional pantheon absorbed new forms of devotion, integrating personal piety, ethical consciousness, and domestic ritual into a coherent theological framework. The syncretic capacity of Egyptian theology allowed it to endure centuries of political change without losing continuity in ritual or belief. By the end of the 18th dynasty, the Egyptian religious landscape had been permanently enriched. Temples continued to assert royal and cosmic authority, but domestic practice had matured into a parallel system of intimate, everyday devotion. Worshippers engaged with gods not only through monumental ritual, but also through personal gestures, prayers, and objects that bridged the human and divine. This expansion of accessibility ensured that religion belonged as much to individuals and households as it did to temples and pharaohs, creating a layered spiritual ecosystem capable of sustaining Egypt's complex society. Faith now belonged to people as much as to temples. Empire became ritual, carved in stone and sunlight. The Ramesside period, spanning the 19th and 20th dynasties, circa 1290 to 1070 BCE, represents the apex of New Kingdom political and religious consolidation. Following centuries of imperial expansion, Egyptian rulers under Ramses II and his successors sought to embed divine authority directly into the landscape, linking theology, statecraft, and monumental architecture. The period demonstrates how religion could function as both ideological unifier and instrument of imperial legitimacy, providing symbolic coherence to a diverse, multi-regional empire. Central to this integration was the deification of the pharaoh himself. Ramses II, often referred to as the Great Son of Egypt, presented himself as the living embodiment of Horus on earth, guarantor of Ma'at, and a cosmic intermediary between gods and subjects. Reliefs and inscriptions at Abu Simbel depict the king alongside Ammonius, Horikti, and Ta, emphasizing both his divine favor and his role as executor of cosmic order. The colossal statues carved into the cliff face visually assert Ramses' fusion of political and divine authority. Sunlight illuminates the inner sanctum twice annually, marking the king's alignment with celestial cycles. In these monuments, imperial ideology becomes inseparable from religious ritual, reinforcing the perception that Egypt's stability was sustained through divine kingship. The Ramesseum, Ramses II's mortuary temple in Thebes, further demonstrates the intersection of theology and empire. Its reliefs narrate the pharaoh's military victories, particularly at Kadesh, framed as divinely sanctioned triumphs. Inscriptions emphasize that the gods, primarily Ammonius Ra, granted him victory, linking military success, religious legitimacy, and imperial governance. Temple complexes were not merely cult centers. They were ideological instruments, propagating a vision of order that encompassed both celestial and terrestrial spheres. Economic records indicate that the Ramesseum controlled large estates and employed hundreds of workers, further integrating religious practice with state administration. Cults during the Ramesside period also functioned as tools of imperial cohesion. Temples dedicated to Ammonius, Mut, Ta, and local deities were strategically expanded throughout Upper and Lower Egypt, Nubia, and the Levant. By venerating the same set of deities across multiple regions, the state reinforced a shared cosmology that transcended provincial boundaries. Inscriptions often record that local populations participated in festivals honoring the king and gods, blending political loyalty with religious devotion. The synchronization of ritual calendars, including coronation festivals, Nile celebrations, and military commemorations, further unified the empire under a single theological and political framework. Interpretively, the theology of empire reflects the mutual reinforcement of divine and political authority. By monumentalizing ritual and codifying ceremonial practices, the pharaoh ensured that imperial power was perceived as natural, cosmic, and enduring. Religious narrative legitimized territorial expansion, military campaigns, and administrative hierarchies, creating a seamless ideological system in which the king's authority was absolute and divinely sanctioned. Temples, statues, and inscriptions acted as enduring symbols of this synthesis, ensuring that empire was remembered as a harmonious order maintained by gods and their earthly representative. Two additional insights clarify the period's significance. First, the Ramesside emphasis on cosmic alignment underscores the Egyptian principle that political authority was inseparable from celestial and ritual order. The precise orientation of temples, solar alignment of statues, and calendrical observances reflect a worldview in which heavenly cycles validated human governance. Second, the period illustrates the propagandistic power of monumental architecture. By embedding theology in stone, relief, and spatial planning, the state transmitted a visual narrative of divine kingship accessible to literate elites, temple personnel, and visiting pilgrims alike. Archaeological evidence from Nubia confirms the imperial reach of these theological principles. The temples at Abu Simbel and Philae not only served local populations but also asserted Egyptian religious and political authority across distant frontiers. Reliefs depict Ramses II as a cosmic warrior, aligned with Ammonius Ra and Horus, whose victories extend Ma'at beyond traditional borders. This integration of military, political, and religious symbolism demonstrates how Ramesside theology functioned to unify a multi-ethnic empire under a single ideological framework. Despite the grandeur of imperial cults, the Ramesside system also relied on localized engagement. Offerings, prayers, and minor cultic activities remained central to daily practice. Household rituals complemented monumental temples, allowing ordinary Egyptians to participate in the divine order through personal devotion, festivals, and household offerings. This dual structure, centralized state cults, and decentralized personal practice, strengthened imperial cohesion by maintaining continuity with older religious traditions while projecting the pharaoh's authority across the empire. By the end of Ramses II's reign, the fusion of divine kingship, monumental architecture, and imperial ritual had reached its zenith. The theology of empire, codified in stone, ritual, and textual inscription, provided both cosmic legitimacy and administrative coherence, ensuring that Egyptian authority was understood as divinely sanctioned. Yet, the concentration of religious, economic, and symbolic power also introduced vulnerabilities. Centralized wealth, priestly influence, and the monumental emphasis on the pharaoh invited challenges from within the state. Imperial power invited challenge from within. Every temple was a map of the universe. During the Ramesside period, temple architecture transcended its role as a site of worship, functioning instead as a cosmic model of creation. Temples were conceived not merely as spaces for ritual, but as miniature representations of the ordered universe, designed to sustain Ma'at and mediate between gods, king, and people. The alignment of walls, pylons, courts, and sanctuaries reflected celestial cycles, mythological geography, and cosmic hierarchy, creating a tangible framework through which Egyptians could interact with divine forces. The temples of Luxor, Medinet Habu, and other major sites exemplify this synthesis of architecture, theology, and ritual. Archaeological and textual evidence demonstrates that temple design was highly symbolic. The layout typically mirrored Egyptian cosmology, beginning with an open forecourt representing the chaotic, fertile world at creation, progressing through hypostyle halls symbolizing the primeval waters of Nun, and culminating in the inner sanctuary, the dwelling place of the deity. Inscriptions emphasize that these spaces were ritualized embodiments of the cosmos. The king, priests, and community acted within them to perpetuate divine order. At Luxor Temple, for instance, reliefs depict the pharaoh performing offerings in a sequence mirroring mythological creation, connecting earthly ritual to celestial processes. Medinet Habu, the mortuary temple of Ramses III, illustrates the integration of cosmic, political, and practical dimensions. The temple's axial design, pylon gateways, and enclosed sanctuaries were aligned with cardinal points, reflecting both solar and stellar patterns. Reliefs along the walls portray the king in ceremonial combat against chaotic forces, reenacting mythic victories over disorder. This architectural and symbolic integration reinforces the notion that temples were dynamic instruments. Through ritual performance, offerings, and structured movement, they actively maintained cosmic balance, rather than serving solely as passive monuments. Temple function extended beyond symbolism to ritual enactment. Priests performed daily offerings, recited hymns, and conducted processions to sustain the deity, feeding the divine essence and ensuring continued favor for the kingdom. This activity is described in inscriptions at Medinet Habu as providing life to the god, renewing the heavens, and keeping the universe intact. The temple was thus a mechanical and metaphysical system, in which material offerings, liturgical language, and spatial arrangement worked together to stabilize both human and cosmic order. Interpretively, temples can be understood as cosmic machines, in which architecture and ritual function to operationalize theology. Every design element, from orientation and reliefs to the sequence of courtyards, encoded mythological and cosmic principles, enabling priests to maintain Ma'at through controlled, repeated action. The replication of divine order within temple precincts ensured that Egypt's social, political, and religious structures were synchronized with cosmic cycles, making the temple both a ritual instrument and an ideological blueprint for the empire. Two additional insights clarify the period's significance. First, the Ramesside temple system illustrates the materialization of abstract cosmology. Concepts of creation, divine hierarchy, and cosmic maintenance were rendered in stone and space, accessible for performance and observation. Second, the temples reinforced the pharaoh's role as cosmic intermediary. By acting within these structured environments, he became both guarantor and executor of divine order. Reliefs at Luxor show the king performing offerings to Ammonius Ra and other gods, aligning human activity with celestial rhythm. The temple's function was therefore simultaneously metaphysical and political, sustaining both heaven and empire. Economic and social evidence supports this functional perspective. Temples controlled extensive estates, workshops, and labor forces, ensuring a steady supply of offerings, materials, and personnel. Grain, livestock, and crafted goods were allocated to maintain daily rituals, reflecting the interdependence of religion, economy, and administration. The wealth and labor required to operate temples demonstrate that cosmic maintenance was both symbolic and practical, with human activity serving as a necessary component in perpetuating divine order. Ritual topography also reinforced the cosmic analogy. Temple precincts often integrated natural and artificial landscapes, sacred lakes, processional avenues, and pylons, corresponding to primeval elements in creation myths. Processions along these avenues symbolize the movement of celestial bodies, connecting festival cycles, liturgical performance, and royal action with mythic time. Pilgrims and worshippers participating in these rituals were thus incorporated into a broader cosmic system, enabling collective engagement with the maintenance of Ma'at. By the end of the 20th dynasty, the conceptualization of temples as cosmic machines had reached its maturity. Luxor, Medinet Habu, and other monumental sites exemplified the integration of architecture, ritual, and theology. Temples served simultaneously as sacred space, operational system, and ideological instrument, linking human activity to the rhythms of the cosmos. This framework ensured that divine, political, and social order were mutually reinforcing, embedding religion at the core of Egyptian imperial governance. But maintaining creation required endless offerings. When kings lost power, the gods' servants ruled instead. By the late Ramesside period, the balance between pharaoh and priesthood had begun to shift. The high priests of Ammonius, based primarily at Karnak, emerged as powerful figures capable of rivaling the authority of the king. Over decades, the combination of wealth, administrative control, and religious legitimacy allowed them to consolidate influence over both Upper and Lower Egypt, fundamentally transforming the nature of governance in the New Kingdom. This period illustrates how the centralized theology that had once reinforced imperial authority could, over time, empower a religious bureaucracy to operate semi-independently of the throne. The priesthood's authority derived from multiple sources. Temples controlled extensive economic resources, including agricultural estates, workshops, and labor forces. For example, records from Karnak indicate that the Temple of Ammonius Ra commanded thousands of workers and vast granaries, effectively functioning as an independent economic entity. Priests managed these resources, overseeing production, collection, and distribution, while simultaneously conducting daily rituals and festivals that legitimized their authority. By monopolizing both spiritual and material capital, the priesthood became a dual power center, with influence rivaling even that of the pharaoh. Religious legitimacy further reinforced priestly dominance. Ammonius Ra's cult had become synonymous with state ideology. The gods themselves were interpreted and administered through the priestly hierarchy. Inscriptions show high priests performing ceremonies traditionally associated with the king, such as offering libations, reciting ritual texts, and consecrating monuments. This practice blurred the distinction between royal and priestly functions, demonstrating that divine authority could be exercised through the bureaucracy as effectively as through the monarchy. The pharaoh's symbolic power persisted, but practical governance increasingly relied on the priest's administration of both sacred and secular duties. The triumph of the priesthood also had a political dimension. During periods of weak or child kings, high priests acted as regents or de facto rulers, overseeing military, economic, and diplomatic affairs. Textual sources from the late 20th dynasty describe priests mediating succession disputes, adjudicating legal cases, and coordinating temple and civic logistics. Their authority was grounded in the perception that they safeguarded Ma'at, maintaining cosmic and social order at a time when pharaonic leadership could not. This theocratic structure demonstrates the inherent tension between ideological centralization and practical administration. The institutions that once enforced divine kingship could, over time, substitute for it when royal power faltered. Interpretively, the rise of the priesthood illustrates the institutionalization of religion as a form of governance. Economic control, ritual function, and bureaucratic administration combined to produce a semi-autonomous power base within the state. Priests became guarantors of both spiritual and temporal stability, underscoring the capacity of religion to function independently of individual rulers while maintaining continuity of imperial ideology. This development also demonstrates the limits of monumental and ideological centralization. No matter how spectacular the temples or compelling the theology, effective governance required ongoing management, which the priesthood increasingly provided. The phenomenon of priestly dominance was reinforced by temple inscriptions and monumental construction. Reliefs at Karnak and Luxor depict high priests performing ceremonies alongside or in place of kings, signaling both continuity with tradition and their elevated status. The maintenance of rituals, festivals, and offerings also ensured that public perception remained aligned with Ammonius's centrality, embedding priestly authority into the cultural consciousness of the empire. Pilgrims and ordinary Egyptians continued to participate in temple life, effectively legitimizing priestly power through communal observance and devotion. However, this concentration of authority within the priesthood carried systemic vulnerabilities. While temples remained centers of stability, reliance on a theocratic elite left the state less able to respond to external threats and internal instability. During the late New Kingdom, incursions by the Sea Peoples, Libyan migrations, and internal revolts revealed the limitations of a religious bureaucracy. While priests could sustain ritual and ideological order, they could not always defend territorial or military interests effectively. Furthermore, the economic weight of temples and their bureaucracies increasingly strained the state's fiscal capacity, contributing to broader political decentralization in the Third Intermediate Period. Two interpretive insights highlight the significance of this transformation. First, the triumph of the priesthood illustrates how religion can become self-sustaining, capable of exercising authority independently of monarchical oversight. Second, it underscores the inherent tension between ideological centralization and bureaucratic autonomy. As temples accrued power, the pharaoh's symbolic supremacy persisted, but practical sovereignty shifted to religious administrators. This pattern would continue into later periods, shaping the structure of Egyptian governance and the interdependence of temple, state, and society. By the end of the 20th dynasty, the Ramesside fusion of monarchy, empire, and theology had begun to unravel. High priests of Ammonius had become indispensable arbiters of cosmic and social order, while pharaonic authority weakened in practice. The stage was set for the challenges of external invasions, territorial contraction, and theological innovation that would define Egypt's subsequent history. This theocracy faced external invasions and new gods. Foreigners rebuilt what Egyptians had forgotten. The Third Intermediate Period, c. 1069 to 664 BCE, was marked by political fragmentation and the emergence of foreign dynasties, most notably of Libyan and Kushite origin, whose reigns reshaped Egyptian religious practice. Following the decline of the New Kingdom, pharaonic authority weakened, and regional powers gained prominence. In this context, foreign rulers adopted and adapted Egypt's traditional theology, integrating local deities with new cultic innovations to legitimize their rule. This period illustrates how religion could both accommodate and reinforce political change, even when the rulers themselves were ethnically or culturally distinct from the traditional elite. The Libyan dynasties, originating from the western desert regions, rose to prominence in the 22nd and 23rd dynasties. Libyan pharaohs maintained continuity with major temples while introducing familial and clan-based priestly networks, blending their own traditions with Egyptian ritual. Inscriptions and temple records indicate that these rulers patronized the temples of Ammonius at Thebes, reinforcing the god's centrality while establishing dynastic legitimacy. Libyan kings often emphasized lineage and hereditary succession, linking themselves symbolically to divine authority through both priestly endorsement and monumental construction. The result was a fusion of foreign political practices with indigenous theological frameworks, which stabilized regions where centralized power was otherwise fragmented. Simultaneously, the Kushite-Nubian dynasty of the 25th dynasty reinvigorated Egyptian religious life from the south. Nubian rulers, originating from the kingdom of Kush, were staunch devotees of Ammonius, particularly in Thebes and at Jebel Barkal. They constructed and restored temples, commissioned monumental reliefs, and integrated Kushite royal iconography with Egyptian religious norms. Archaeological evidence shows that temples rebuilt or expanded by these rulers were carefully aligned with Egyptian cosmology, maintaining sacred axial orientations and ritual topography. By emphasizing devotion to Ammonius, the Kushite pharaohs not only legitimized their reign, but also revitalized a theology that had waned during the political fragmentation of the late New Kingdom and early Third Intermediate period. This period also witnessed priestly decentralization and adaptation. Regional cults gained increased autonomy, often incorporating local deities alongside state-sanctioned gods. In Lower Egypt, for example, Nile-associated deities were integrated with the worship of Ammonius and Ptah, producing hybrid cults that combined mythic and geographic significance. These innovations demonstrate the flexibility of Egyptian theology, which could absorb new influences while preserving essential doctrinal elements. Foreign rulers, by endorsing these practices, created a religious framework that simultaneously asserted authority and promoted cultural continuity. Interpretively, Libyan and Kushite integration of Egyptian theology underscores several points. First, religion served as a tool of political legitimization. Foreign rulers could assert divine sanction by embracing established deities, participating in ritual observances, and commissioning temple projects. Second, the period demonstrates the resilience and adaptability of Egyptian religious practice. Even in times of political decentralization, sacred traditions provided continuity, linking disparate regions and communities through shared cosmology. Third, the Kushite devotion to Ammonius highlights the cross-cultural appeal of key deities, whose worship transcended ethnic and linguistic boundaries. Textual and archaeological evidence confirms this synthesis. Inscriptions at Jebel Barkal, Thebes, and Napata emphasize the king's dual role as military leader and divine representative, often showing the pharaoh receiving life and authority directly from Ammonius. Temple restoration projects, such as those at Karnak and Jebel Barkal, were conducted according to traditional ritual practices, including alignment with celestial events, procession routes, and offering schedules. In effect, Nubian and Libyan rulers operated within the established theological framework, ensuring that foreign control did not undermine the perceived stability of the cosmic order. Economic and administrative structures further reinforced this fusion. Temples continued to manage estates, labor, and resources, while foreign dynasties relied on these institutions to assert control over both population and territory. By maintaining religious centrality and ritual observance, rulers projected both authority and piety, integrating political, economic, and theological governance. This demonstrates the interdependence of religious and administrative systems in sustaining Egyptian cultural and imperial cohesion. By the end of this phase, foreign dynasties had reinvigorated Egypt's religious life, integrating external influences without fundamentally altering core beliefs. The Libyan and Kushite rulers exemplified a pragmatic approach, adopting Egyptian theological and ritual norms while leveraging them to consolidate political power. Their reigns reveal that religion functioned as a bridge between continuity and innovation, sustaining cultural identity even amid political upheaval. A final native revival sought to restore ancient purity. In its twilight, Egypt rediscovered its past. The 26th dynasty, commonly referred to as the Sate period, c. 664 to 525 BCE, represents a deliberate cultural and religious revival following centuries of foreign rule and fragmentation. Based in Sais in the western Nile Delta, native rulers sought to restore the prestige of pharaonic authority and reaffirm traditional religious practices, emphasizing archaism and continuity with Egypt's ancient past. This renaissance reflected both a political strategy, asserting legitimacy in the face of regional instability, and a theological agenda designed to preserve the sanctity of Egypt's enduring pantheon and ritual traditions. One hallmark of the Sate revival was the rebuilding and restoration of temples across Upper and Lower Egypt. Key projects included refurbishments at Sais, Memphis, and Thebes, where structures originally constructed during the Old and New Kingdoms were repaired, expanded, or replicated. Inscriptions detail the meticulous adherence to traditional architectural and ritual standards, including proper axial orientation, alignment with cardinal points, and the maintenance of sacred lakes and processional routes. These restorations not only reinforced the king's role as divine mediator but also reaffirmed the cosmic order, asserting that Egypt remained the living embodiment of Ma'at despite centuries of political turbulence. Archaism extended beyond architecture into artistic and textual practice. Sculptors and scribes deliberately emulated Old and Middle Kingdom styles, replicating hieroglyphic conventions, statuary proportions, and relief compositions. This conscious conservatism reflected a desire to legitimize contemporary rule through visual continuity, signaling to both domestic and foreign audiences that Sate rulers were the heirs to Egypt's timeless authority. Archaeological finds, such as stelae, sarcophagi, and temple reliefs, demonstrate the replication of canonical forms, suggesting that cultural memory was a central instrument of statecraft during this period. Textual preservation was another central feature of the Sate Renaissance. Scholars and scribes actively recopied ancient religious, literary, and funerary texts, including portions of the pyramid texts, coffin texts, and earlier hymns. These efforts, often carried out in temple scriptoria, ensured that ritual knowledge, liturgy, and theological interpretation remained accessible to priests and future generations. By conserving and systematizing sacred literature, the Sate kings reinforced both religious orthodoxy and institutional continuity, bridging centuries of interruption caused by foreign dynasties and regional fragmentation. Theologically, the Sate revival emphasized the primacy of traditional gods, particularly Ammonius Ra, Ptah, and Osiris, while also reinforcing the pharaoh's role as divine intermediary. Ritual texts and inscriptions depict kings performing offerings, consecrating temples, and maintaining cosmic order, echoing practices from the New Kingdom while adapting them to contemporary political and social conditions. This revivalist ideology presented Egypt as a resilient, self-contained civilization, capable of reclaiming cultural and religious authority even amid geopolitical threats. Interpretively, the Sate Renaissance demonstrates how archaism functions as both ideology and administration. By consciously emulating the past, rulers conveyed legitimacy, stabilized ritual practice, and provided a model for political authority that transcended individual reigns. It also reflects a pragmatic adaptation. By preserving ancient texts, architectural forms, and religious routines, Sate rulers could unify a diverse populace under a shared memory of Egypt's enduring cultural identity. This emphasis on continuity reinforced the perception of the pharaoh as the guardian of tradition and cosmic balance, rather than merely a temporal ruler. Economically, temple-centered projects played a dual role. Restoration campaigns employed artisans, scribes, and laborers, stimulating local economies while sustaining the religious and ritual apparatus necessary for cosmic maintenance. Temples again served as both spiritual and administrative hubs, controlling estates, labor forces, and agricultural production. This dual function reinforced the interdependence of ritual and governance, ensuring that Sate religiosity was inseparable from state administration. By the end of the 26th dynasty, Egypt had succeeded in a partial revival of pharaonic authority and religious centrality. Temples were active, texts preserved, and traditional iconography reinstated, creating a sense of continuity with Egypt's distant past. While political independence remained precarious, eventually challenged by the rise of the Persian Empire, the Sate Renaissance illustrates the enduring power of cultural memory and religious legitimacy as instruments of statecraft. But world empires pressed upon the Nile. Conquered, Egypt turned memory into resistance. The Persian conquest of Egypt in 525 BCE, under Cambyses II, marked the beginning of the first period of Achaemenid rule, 525 to 404 BCE. Despite foreign domination, Egyptian religion remained resilient, serving as both a vehicle of cultural continuity and a subtle form of political resistance. The Persians largely acknowledged and preserved the temples, recognizing their central role in local governance, economic production, and social cohesion. By co-opting temple wealth and ritual authority, the empire maintained order while subordinating Egypt to imperial administration. Economic and administrative records indicate that the Persian satraps implemented temple taxation and oversight, ensuring that offerings, estates, and resources continued to flow into both religious and state channels. Rather than dismantling sacred institutions, they utilized them to legitimize imperial control. Temples maintained public ritual, while the pharaoh imagery persisted symbolically, even under Persian rule. Inscriptions suggest that Egyptian priests were permitted to continue daily rites, festivals, and the upkeep of sacred architecture, emphasizing that the gods remained central to society despite foreign governance. Religious continuity also provided a framework for national identity and resistance. Egyptian texts from this period often frame Persian occupation in terms of cosmic disruption, portraying invaders as threats to Ma'at who must be countered through proper ritual observance. Priests emphasized their role as defenders of the gods, maintaining temples, performing offerings, and sustaining festivals as acts of spiritual and cultural resilience. Archaeological evidence from Karnak, Memphis, and other major sites shows temple restorations continuing during the occupation, signaling that religious activity remained a locus of national coherence and memory. Interpretively, the Persian period demonstrates that religion functioned as both a stabilizing and subversive force. While the empire benefited from the cooperation of priestly institutions, these same institutions preserved the ideology of Egyptian kingship and cosmic order. By sustaining Ma'at, priests ensured that Egyptian identity persisted independently of political sovereignty. The temples acted as cultural repositories, conserving ritual knowledge, sacred texts, and iconography, which would later influence Ptolemaic and Roman religious practices. Persian rulers also interacted selectively with Egyptian theology. While acknowledging Ammonius, Ptah, and Osiris, they introduced subtle administrative and symbolic adjustments, such as incorporating imperial titulary or delegating control over certain estates to satraps. Yet, these changes were primarily bureaucratic, leaving the essential cosmological and cultic framework intact. In practice, the period illustrates how imperial oversight could coexist with local religious autonomy, preserving ritual continuity even under occupation. Economically, temples remained centers of production and redistribution. They controlled extensive agricultural lands, managed labor forces, and produced offerings necessary for ritual performance. Persian taxation ensured that temples contributed to the imperial treasury, but also reinforced their societal centrality, embedding religious authority into both local and imperial governance. Ritual and administration were intertwined, demonstrating the resilience of Egyptian institutions in sustaining social and cosmic order. By the end of the First Persian occupation, Egypt had retained religious and cultural continuity despite political subjugation. Temples continued to function as centers of worship and administration. Priests maintained ritual authority, and sacred traditions remained active in daily life. This period illustrates that faith and memory can serve as forms of cultural resistance, allowing a society to survive conquest while preserving its identity and cosmology. The next conqueror would bring Greece and a new age of gods. When Alexander came to Egypt, even he bowed to the gods. The conquest of Egypt by Alexander the Great in 332 BCE marked the beginning of a transformative era in Egyptian religious and political life. Alexander's entry was accompanied by both military domination and strategic engagement with local traditions. He presented himself as a liberator to the native population, honoring Egyptian temples and deities, particularly Ammonius at the Oracle of Siwa. This early gesture of reverence established a template for the Hellenistic integration of religious and political authority, positioning Greek rulers as legitimate successors to the pharaohs. Following Alexander's death in 323 BCE, Ptolemy Isoter, one of his generals, assumed control of Egypt, founding the Ptolemaic dynasty 305 to 30 BCE. From the outset, The Ptolemies pursued a dual strategy of religious syncretism and political consolidation. They retained traditional Egyptian priesthoods, funded temple construction, and respected existing ritual calendars, while simultaneously introducing Greek religious forms, cults, and artistic motifs. Inscriptions and temple dedications from Alexandria and Memphis illustrate this blending. Greek rulers adopted Egyptian titulary and iconography, presenting themselves as both Hellenistic monarchs and divine pharaohs. The foundation of Alexandria as the new capital reinforced this duality. The city was designed as a cosmopolitan hub, blending Greek architectural planning, Egyptian religious symbolism, and international trade. Temples and shrines in Alexandria often housed both Greek and Egyptian cults, creating shared sacred spaces that reflected the cultural fusion central to Ptolemaic ideology. Archaeological evidence shows that shrines to Egyptian gods such as Isis and Serapis were established alongside Greek religious institutions, signaling the deliberate cultivation of a religious synthesis capable of unifying diverse populations. Ptolemaic rulers also adapted Egyptian theology to serve dynastic legitimacy and imperial control. Statues, reliefs, and coins depict the Ptolemies performing traditional offerings, participating in festivals, and commissioning temple inscriptions. These acts reinforce their role as cosmic mediators, sustaining Ma'at while bridging Greek and Egyptian audiences. The incorporation of Greek artistic realism into Egyptian statuary and temple reliefs further emphasized the dynasty's dual identity, signaling both continuity and innovation. Interpretively, the foundation of the Ptolemaic kingdom demonstrates that religion could be a tool of cross-cultural governance. By respecting Egyptian sacred traditions while introducing Greek forms, the Ptolemies secured priestly cooperation, maintained popular legitimacy, and projected authority across both native and Hellenistic communities. The deliberate fusion of religious forms also reflects an understanding of faith as a stabilizing and integrative force, capable of transcending ethnicity and language. Economic and administrative structures supported this synthesis. Temples remained centers of wealth, employing priests, scribes, and laborers, while Greek administrators managed taxation, trade, and military logistics. The interdependence of sacred and civic institutions ensured that religion reinforced political and economic stability, sustaining the Ptolemaic state amid internal challenges and regional pressures. Furthermore, temple endowments and dedications provided both public and private avenues for participation, allowing Egyptians and Greeks alike to engage with divine authority through offerings, rituals, and festival attendance. By the end of the early Ptolemaic period, Egypt had entered a new religious landscape. The dynasty successfully established itself as both political rulers and custodians of sacred tradition. Alexander's initial deference to Ammonius set a precedent that legitimized Hellenistic authority while preserving the pharaonic framework, and the Ptolemies expanded this synthesis, creating an environment where Greek and Egyptian gods could coexist and even merge, laying the groundwork for the emergence of syncretic deities such as Serapis. A new god would soon be born, one for Greeks and Egyptians alike. The gods of Egypt learned to speak Greek. Under Ptolemy Isoter, r. 305 to 283 BCE, the Egyptian religious landscape underwent a deliberate process of syncretism, producing deities that could resonate with both Greek and Egyptian subjects. Central to this effort was the creation of Serapis, a composite deity designed to unify the religious sensibilities of diverse populations. Serapis combined features of Osiris and Apis with attributes recognizable to Hellenistic worshippers, including aspects of Hades and Zeus. Temple inscriptions and reliefs at Canopus document the careful orchestration of iconography and ritual, presenting Serapis as a universal god whose authority encompassed the afterlife, fertility, and protection of the state. The Canopus Decree, 238 BCE, provides textual evidence for the deliberate promotion of Serapis. The decree, issued under Ptolemy III, codifies priestly and civic obligations toward the new cult, detailing offerings, festivals, and temple construction. By formalizing Serapis worship through legal and ritual channels, the Ptolemies ensured that the deity functioned as both political instrument and spiritual mediator, reinforcing dynastic legitimacy while appealing to a multicultural populace. Archaeologists have found temples dedicated to Serapis in Alexandria, Memphis, and later across the Hellenistic world, demonstrating the deity's transnational reach. Alongside Serapis, the cult of Isis expanded dramatically, achieving a level of popularity unmatched in previous periods. Traditionally associated with Osiris and Egyptian domestic piety, Isis was reinterpreted in Hellenistic contexts as a cosmic, maternal, and protective goddess. Her worship was particularly adaptable, appealing to Greeks, Romans, and other Mediterranean populations. Temples on Delos and other Aegean islands attest to her widespread veneration, with dedications in Greek, Egyptian, and bilingual inscriptions. This expansion illustrates the globalization of Egyptian religion, facilitated by the Ptolemaic dynasty's strategic promotion of cults that transcended ethnic and cultural boundaries. Interpretively, the creation of Serapis and the globalization of Isis worship highlight the instrumental role of religion in Hellenistic statecraft. By designing deities intelligible to multiple cultural groups, the Ptolemies reinforced political authority while fostering a sense of shared sacred space. Serapis functioned as a mediator between Greek rationalist concepts of divinity and Egyptian cosmology, while Isis offered continuity with traditional Egyptian religious practice. Together, these cults exemplify how strategic syncretism could serve both spiritual and political objectives, ensuring social cohesion and the propagation of imperial ideology. Temple architecture and ritual practice further illustrate the hybrid nature of these cults. Serapeums and Isis temples often combined Greek columnar forms with Egyptian axial planning, embedding iconographic and spatial symbolism that communicated dual identities. Festivals and processions incorporated Greek-style hymns and sacrifices alongside Egyptian liturgical sequences. Archaeological evidence from Alexandria indicates that these practices were institutionalized, with temple administrators overseeing a combination of Hellenistic and Egyptian ritual protocols. By maintaining fidelity to both traditions, the Ptolemies created a religious infrastructure capable of unifying a diverse empire. Economic and administrative integration reinforced the cult's influence. Temples of Serapis and Isis controlled estates, workshops, and labor, contributing to both local economies and the royal treasury. Offerings, endowments, and priestly management ensured that these institutions were financially and socially central, extending the reach of the Ptolemaic state into daily life. The hybrid deities thus served not only as spiritual intermediaries, but also as mechanisms for resource management, social cohesion, and dynastic propaganda. By the mid-3rd century BCE, Serapis had become the patron deity of Alexandria, while Isis's cult had begun to penetrate the wider Mediterranean, influencing religious practices from Greece to Italy. The Ptolemies effectively created a transcultural theology, demonstrating that Egyptian gods could adapt to new linguistic, cultural, and geographic contexts without losing their foundational identities. In doing so, they established a model of religious flexibility and universality that would endure into Roman times. Two interpretive insights emerge from this period. First, the Ptolemaic synthesis demonstrates the strategic utility of religious innovation. Deities were designed to unite populations and legitimize rule, blending iconography, ritual, and theology to serve political objectives. Second, the spread of Isis and Serapis illustrates the global potential of Egyptian religion. Rooted in traditional cosmology yet intelligible to new audiences, these cults became enduring features of the Hellenistic and later Roman Mediterranean world. By the conclusion of this phase, Ptolemaic Egypt had successfully transformed its pantheon into a bridge between cultures, creating gods capable of appealing simultaneously to Egyptians and Greeks. The deliberate construction of Serapis and the internationalization of Isis worship exemplify the capacity of religious institutions to mediate political authority, cultural integration, and social cohesion in a cosmopolitan empire. Their voices carried across the Mediterranean. Philosophers and priests began to speak the same language of eternity. During the Ptolemaic period, 332 to 30 BCE, Egyptian religious tradition intersected with Hellenistic philosophy, producing a unique synthesis of spiritual thought, ritual practice, and mystical speculation. The fusion was particularly evident in the development of Hermeticism, mystery cults, and the reinterpretation of traditional deities such as Thoth. Greek philosophers, traveling scholars, and Egyptian priests engaged in intellectual exchange, translating and adapting Egyptian theological concepts into philosophical frameworks intelligible to a Hellenistic audience. This cross-fertilization exemplifies the ability of Egyptian cosmology to transcend cultural boundaries, influencing Mediterranean thought well beyond the Nile. The figure of Thoth, the god of writing, wisdom, and cosmic order, became central to this synthesis. Identified with Hermes Trismegistus, Thoth was interpreted as the ultimate source of knowledge, encompassing theology, cosmology, and ethics. Texts attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, later compiled in the Corpus Hermeticum, blend Egyptian metaphysical concepts with Greek philosophical reasoning, emphasizing the unity of divine intelligence, cosmic law, and human spiritual ascent. Inscriptions and papyri from Ptolemaic Egypt indicate that these ideas circulated among educated elites, priests, and philosophers, demonstrating that Egyptian mystical knowledge was actively integrated into Hellenistic intellectual currents. Mystery cults, including those centered on Isis, Serapis, and Osiris, further exemplified this interaction. Rituals emphasized initiation, esoteric knowledge, and the promise of salvation or rebirth, blending traditional Egyptian afterlife beliefs with Greek concepts of the soul and cosmic harmony. Archaeological evidence from temples, sanctuaries, and cryptic inscriptions suggests that these cults employed theurgical practices, including symbolic offerings, sacred chants, and meditative rites, to align the practitioner with cosmic order. The Ptolemies actively supported these cults, which both reinforced political legitimacy and facilitated cultural synthesis, creating spiritual frameworks accessible to Egyptians, Greeks, and broader Mediterranean communities. Interpretively, the Hellenistic adoption of Egyptian mystical thought illustrates several key dynamics. First, it reflects the adaptability of Egyptian theology, capable of informing philosophical inquiry while maintaining its indigenous identity. Second, it demonstrates the mutual influence of Greek and Egyptian intellectual traditions. Philosophy was enriched by ritual and symbolism, while Egyptian religion acquired new frameworks for universalizing its cosmology. Third, the role of Thoth/Hermes Trismegistus highlights the centrality of writing, knowledge, and ritual as mediators of cosmic order, emphasizing continuity between temple practice and abstract speculation. Textual evidence confirms that Hermetic writings circulated widely in Ptolemaic and later Roman Egypt, often in Greek translations of earlier Egyptian hieroglyphic or demotic texts. These documents detail cosmological hierarchies, the correspondence of macrocosm and microcosm, and ethical precepts linking human conduct to divine law. Temple priests, educated in sacred knowledge, likely served as intermediaries, preserving ritual practice while translating Egyptian thought into philosophical discourse. The resulting intellectual milieu bridged practical ritual, theological doctrine, and philosophical abstraction, demonstrating the integrative capacity of Egyptian mysticism. Temples remained central to this synthesis. Sanctuaries functioned as both ritual centers and intellectual hubs, where initiates could access esoteric knowledge, participate in sacred ceremonies, and engage with philosophical ideas. The architecture of temples, particularly in Thebes and Alexandria, reflected this dual role. Axial halls, sanctuaries, and cryptic inscriptions guided ritual action while encoding symbolic knowledge that could be interpreted philosophically. By situating intellectual and religious practice within the same sacred space, the Ptolemaic system reinforced the continuity of Egyptian cosmology even in a Hellenized cultural context. Economically and socially, these practices were supported by temple estates and the broader administrative apparatus. Temple wealth funded rituals, scribal schools, and initiatory programs, ensuring the transmission of knowledge across generations. Initiates from diverse backgrounds, Greek, Egyptian, and mercantile, participated in these practices, illustrating the cosmopolitan appeal of Egyptian mysticism and its integration into daily life, civic ceremony, and philosophical discourse. By the end of the Ptolemaic period, the cross-fertilization of Egyptian mysticism and Hellenistic philosophy had produced a lasting intellectual legacy, linking ritual practice, metaphysical inquiry, and ethical reflection. Figures such as Hermes Trismegistus exemplify how Egyptian deities could be reinterpreted within new philosophical frameworks, while mystery cults extended the reach of Egyptian religion across the Mediterranean. This synthesis demonstrates that Egyptian thought was both resilient and adaptable, capable of engaging with foreign ideas while preserving core cosmological principles. Yet the ancient temples would soon meet a new fate. The empire of emperors inherited the empire of gods. Following Rome's annexation of Egypt in 30 BCE, the administration of the Nile Valley entered a new phase of integration within a global imperial system. While Egypt became a province governed by a prefect appointed from Rome, the temples remained central to both religious and economic life. Roman authorities recognized the practical value of sustaining the priesthood and ritual networks, understanding that the temples functioned as both spiritual centers and economic powerhouses, capable of mobilizing labor, managing estates, and collecting tribute. The temple economy retained structures established during the Ptolemaic period. Temples controlled extensive agricultural lands, maintained workshops, and employed large numbers of priests, scribes, and laborers. They oversaw the production of offerings, distribution of food and goods, and management of local estates. Papyrus records from the Roman period, including tax ledgers and temple inventories, indicate that priests continued to exercise significant administrative authority, even under imperial oversight. Their economic role was indispensable, ensuring that ritual obligations and state revenue could coexist under a single institutional framework. Roman emperors generally tolerated the existing priesthood and temple hierarchy. While governors and prefects exercised political and military control, they often deferred to local religious authorities in matters of ritual observance, temple administration, and festival management. Temples maintained traditional festivals such as Opet and the Nile inundation celebrations, which continued to reinforce the cosmic order, Ma'at. Inscriptions and reliefs from Karnak, Philae, and Dendra depict Roman officials participating in ceremonial events, demonstrating the mutual recognition of authority. The emperor upheld political and military order, while priests sustained ritual and cosmic legitimacy. Priestly resilience under Roman rule also illustrates the institutional autonomy of Egyptian religion. Despite centuries of foreign dominance and integration into a global empire, the priesthood maintained doctrinal continuity, ritual precision, and hierarchical control over temple estates. They adapted to Roman administrative structures while preserving traditional Egyptian cosmology, deity worship, and liturgical practice. Archaeological evidence indicates that temples continued to commission statues, reliefs, and inscriptions emphasizing pharaohic continuity, even as the office of the king was replaced by imperial governors. Interpretively, the Roman period demonstrates the durability and adaptability of Egyptian religious institutions. Temples functioned simultaneously as centers of spiritual authority, economic management, and social cohesion. By accommodating Roman political structures while sustaining indigenous ritual practice, the priesthood preserved a cultural and religious identity that transcended imperial change. This period underscores that Egyptian religion was not merely ceremonial but integral to governance and economic administration, capable of mediating between local society and global imperial power. Temple architecture and ritual practice also reflected the integration of Roman influence with Egyptian tradition. Additions and restorations often incorporated Roman stylistic elements, yet axial planning, sanctuaries, and sacred spaces adhered to centuries-old conventions. Priests continued to oversee offerings, temple cults, and festivals in accordance with canonical practice, while Roman officials occasionally participated in or funded these activities. This arrangement created a practical symbiosis, allowing Roman authority to exercise political and fiscal control, while the priesthood maintained continuity of sacred order. Economically, temples were essential for local and provincial administration. Estates produced grain, livestock, and craft goods, which supplied both ritual offerings and the broader needs of the populace. Taxation and tribute flowed through temple networks, providing the imperial administration with stable revenue while ensuring that temples retained operational autonomy. This dual role reinforced the centrality of religion in daily life, illustrating how spiritual and material authority could coexist under imperial oversight. By the end of the first 3 centuries CE, Egyptian temples had demonstrated remarkable continuity. Festivals persisted, sacred architecture was maintained, and the priesthood retained administrative, ritual, and economic authority. Roman Egypt thus exemplifies a period in which foreign political domination did not erase indigenous religious practice, but rather incorporated it into a broader imperial framework. Temples continued to function as nodes of social, economic, and cosmological stability, providing continuity amid the political changes of empire. But another empire, spiritual and universal, was rising. From Alexandria to Pompeii, Isis ruled the hearts of millions. During the Roman period, the cults of Isis and Osiris experienced unprecedented geographical expansion, extending far beyond the Nile Valley into Italy, Gaul, Greece, and the Eastern Mediterranean. Roman trade networks, naval routes, and urban centers facilitated the dissemination of Egyptian religious practices. Temples and shrines dedicated to Isis appeared in Alexandria, Rome, Pompeii, Ostia, Delos, and Ephesus, reflecting her broad appeal to a diverse populace, including Roman elites, merchants, and ordinary citizens. Archaeological evidence, including reliefs, inscriptions, and statuary, documents the standardized iconography of Isis, often depicted with a throne-shaped crown, sistrum, and solar disk, signaling continuity with her Egyptian origins while accommodating Hellenistic stylistic preferences. The cult of Osiris remained intimately connected to Isis, emphasizing death, resurrection, and immortality. Roman initiates were drawn to the promise of personal salvation and spiritual rebirth, concepts that resonated across social and cultural boundaries. Rituals often included ceremonial bathing, hymns, and processions, echoing Egyptian temple practices adapted to urban Roman settings. Excavations of sanctuaries in Pompeii, for example, reveal shrines with altars, offerings, and frescoes depicting Isis and Osiris in traditional Egyptian poses, yet incorporating Greco-Roman artistic techniques. Literary sources further document the influence of these cults. Plutarch's De Iside et Osiride provides a detailed account of Osiris's death, resurrection, and the moral dimensions of Egyptian theology, emphasizing its compatibility with broader philosophical thought. Plutarch presents Isis as both a nurturing goddess and an agent of cosmic order, highlighting her ethical and spiritual significance. Roman writers such as Apuleius and Horapollo similarly reference Egyptian deities, often portraying Isis as a mediator between human and divine realms, reinforcing her role in both private devotion and public ritual. Interpretively, the Roman proliferation of Isis and Osiris worship illustrates the universalizing capacity of Egyptian religion. Unlike state-centered cults tied to territorial authority, these deities addressed individual spiritual needs, promising moral reward and eternal life. This universality facilitated cross-cultural adoption, enabling Roman citizens and foreigners to participate fully in rituals while preserving the core Egyptian cosmology. The adaptation of iconography, language, and ritual structure exemplifies the flexibility of Egyptian religious practice, capable of thriving in cosmopolitan and transnational contexts. Temples and shrines served dual purposes in the Roman world. They were ritual centers, maintaining liturgical cycles, festivals, and initiatory rites, and social hubs, supporting charitable distributions, communal gatherings, and education for initiates. Evidence from Delos, Ostia, and Pompeii indicates that priesthoods remained active, often bilingual, ensuring that rites were accessible to both Greek-speaking and Latin-speaking devotees. The continued role of priests reflects the institutional durability of Egyptian religious authority under Roman governance. Economically, the expansion of Isis and Osiris cults supported local and regional economies. Offerings of food, incense, and crafted goods circulated through temple networks, while festivals and processions drew pilgrims and visitors, stimulating commerce. Temples often received endowments from Roman patrons, linking religious devotion with social prestige and civic engagement. This integration of spiritual and economic activity demonstrates the enduring symbiosis of religion and material infrastructure in sustaining Egyptian cults abroad. By the 3rd century CE, the Isis and Osiris cults had achieved trans-Mediterranean prominence, influencing subsequent religious developments, including early Christian symbolism. Their promise of resurrection, moral order, and personal salvation resonated across cultural lines, establishing a template for universalist faiths in the Roman world. Despite political shifts and imperial reforms, these Egyptian deities maintained vitality, illustrating that religion could transcend political boundaries, geographic distance, and cultural change. Her reign would end not in conquest, but in conversion. The old gods fell silent, but their echoes endured. By the late 4th and early 5th centuries CE, Christianity had become the dominant religion of the Roman Empire, fundamentally transforming the religious landscape of Egypt. Imperial edicts, particularly under Theodosius I.R. 379 to 395 CE, outlawed pagan worship, mandated the closure of temples, and prohibited traditional sacrifices. Temples that had stood for millennia, including those at Philae, Dendra, and Karnak, faced either abandonment or conversion into Christian sanctuaries. These measures marked the formal end of state-sponsored Egyptian religious practice, though local traditions and cultic memory persisted in informal settings for several generations. The temple at Philae represents the final chapter of formal Egyptian ritual. Records indicate that priests continued offering traditional rites into the 5th century, even as imperial authorities increasingly restricted access. Archaeological and epigraphic evidence documents a gradual cessation of ceremonies, culminating in the temple's official closure around 537 CE under Byzantine control. Ritual texts, inscriptions, and the careful maintenance of sacred spaces attest to the determined persistence of priestly authority up to this final period. The closure did not erase centuries of religious knowledge. Rather, it preserved it within texts, inscriptions, and cultural memory. Christianization involved both suppression and adaptation. Pagan festivals, iconography, and sacred sites were often repurposed, integrated into Christian liturgy, or symbolically reinterpreted. Temples sometimes became churches, and Egyptian motifs survived in Christian art, mosaics, and architecture. These transformations reflect the continuity of sacred space and ritual function, even as theological frameworks changed. Egyptian religion, though officially silenced, left enduring traces that shaped the religious and cultural fabric of the Nile Valley. Interpretively, the closure of the temples demonstrates the complex interplay between political authority and religious continuity. While imperial power could terminate formal worship, the resilience of Egyptian cosmology persisted in memory, art, and textual preservation. Scholars and later travelers, including Byzantine and Islamic chroniclers, recorded these traditions, ensuring their survival beyond the active ritual context. This persistence highlights the durability of religious institutions, even under prolonged suppression. Economically, the termination of temple activity disrupted traditional estates, labor systems, and resource management, yet many administrative practices were absorbed into emerging Christian structures. Temples had functioned as hubs for production, taxation, and social welfare, and the adaptation of some sites into churches maintained elements of these roles, preserving aspects of the material and social infrastructure that had supported Egyptian religiosity for millennia. By the early 6th century CE, Egypt's ancient temples had ceased their ritual function, but the ideological, textual, and artistic legacies of the gods endured. Inscriptions, papyri, and sacred architecture provided the foundation for later rediscovery and scholarly study. Though the active cults of Isis, Osiris, Ammonius, and others had ended, their cosmology, ethical concepts, and symbolic frameworks remained embedded in Egyptian cultural memory. Those echoes would resurface through memory and rediscovery. After 2 millennia of silence, the hieroglyphs spoke again. The modern rediscovery of Egyptian religion and civilization began in earnest during the late 18th and early 19th centuries, a period marked by European exploration, colonial expansion, and scholarly inquiry. Central to this process was Napoleon Bonaparte's Egyptian expedition, 1798 to 1801, which combined military conquest with systematic study of ancient monuments. Accompanied by engineers, artists, and scholars, the expedition produced the monumental description de l'Egypte, documenting temples, inscriptions, and artifacts across the Nile Valley. These records provided European scholars with the first systematic visual and textual survey of Egyptian civilization, bringing ancient religious structures, iconography, and architectural features back into modern awareness. The discovery of the Rosetta Stone, 1799, proved pivotal. Found near the town of Rosetta, Rashid, the artifact contained a decree issued during the reign of Ptolemy V, 196 BCE. Inscribed in 3 scripts, Greek, Demotic, and hieroglyphic. Its bilingual nature provided the critical key for understanding ancient Egyptian writing, offering a direct link between known Greek and unknown Egyptian texts. Scholars immediately recognized its potential for unlocking centuries of religious, political, and literary knowledge. The breakthrough came in 1822, when Jean-François Champollion announced the decipherment of hieroglyphs. By analyzing the Rosetta Stone and other inscriptions, Champollion demonstrated that hieroglyphs functioned as a combination of phonetic and ideographic signs, capable of conveying both sound and meaning. This decipherment revolutionized the study of Egyptian religion, enabling scholars to read religious texts, funerary inscriptions, and temple writings with unprecedented accuracy. Pyramids, tombs, and temples, long silent, could now be understood within their historical and theological contexts. Early Egyptologists quickly applied this newfound knowledge to texts such as the pyramid texts, coffin texts, and the Book of the Dead, revealing the structure of Egyptian cosmology, the pantheon of gods and rituals governing life, death, and the afterlife. These studies clarified previously obscure references to deities such as Osiris, Isis, Ammonius, and Thoth, demonstrating the interplay between theology, ritual, and political authority. The decipherment also illuminated the chronology of dynasties, allowing scholars to reconstruct the historical evolution of Egyptian religion from pre-dynastic cults to the Ptolemaic synthesis. Interpretively, the age of exploration and decipherment highlights the interdependence of archaeology, philology, and historical analysis. Monumental surveys provided the raw data, while linguistic breakthroughs allowed for precise interpretation. This combination enabled a systematic reconstruction of ancient religious thought, revealing both continuity and transformation across millennia. Furthermore, it underscored the importance of material culture as a repository of religious knowledge, demonstrating how architecture, inscriptions, and artifacts collectively preserve theological and social systems. The expansion of European fieldwork in the 19th century further enriched the study of Egyptian religion. Excavations at Saqqara, Luxor, Thebes, and Abydos unearthed tombs, stelae, and temple complexes, providing archaeological evidence to corroborate textual sources. These discoveries confirmed the historical existence of deities, priesthoods, and ritual practices, illustrating how cosmology, kingship, and cultic institutions were intertwined. For example, the rediscovery of the mortuary temples of Seti I and Ramses II offered insight into royal theology, the cult of Osiris, and funerary practices, while tombs from the New Kingdom revealed how personal piety and afterlife beliefs evolved alongside political authority. The European fascination with Egyptian religion also intersected with intellectual movements such as Romanticism, Enlightenment thought, and later, the development of anthropology and comparative religion. Scholars began to analyze Egyptian cosmology in the context of broader Mediterranean and Near Eastern religious traditions, exploring parallels with Greek, Jewish, and early Christian thought. This comparative approach highlighted the influence and resilience of Egyptian religious ideas, many of which had persisted, transformed, or been transmitted through Hellenistic and Roman syncretism. By the mid-19th century, the combined efforts of explorers, philologists, and archaeologists had reintroduced Egyptian religion into global consciousness. The hieroglyphs, once indecipherable, became a window into the beliefs, ethics, and ritual life of a civilization that had dominated the Nile for over 3 millennia. Temples, inscriptions, and papyri allowed scholars to trace the development of divine kingship, funerary ideology, temple cults, and popular piety, providing a comprehensive understanding of Egypt's religious evolution. In sum, the age of exploration and the decipherment of hieroglyphs marked the rebirth of Egyptian religious knowledge in the modern world. Through systematic observation, linguistic analysis, and archaeological investigation, scholars reconstructed the theological, social, and political dimensions of ancient Egyptian faith. The hieroglyphs, once silent for 2,000 years, now speak with clarity, enabling a full historical comprehension of the gods, temples, and spiritual practices that shaped the civilization of the Nile. With language recovered, meaning soon followed. Scholars rebuilt a cosmos from fragments of stone. Following the decipherment of hieroglyphs, the study of Egyptian religion entered a phase of systematic academic reconstruction throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. Early scholars sought to translate, contextualize, and synthesize texts and material evidence, aiming to reconstruct the cosmology, theology, and ritual practice of ancient Egypt with precision. Central figures in this process included Gustav Maspero, Kurt Seith, and Erich Hornung, whose work established the foundations of modern Egyptology and shaped contemporary understanding of the Egyptian religious worldview. Maspero, 1846 to 1916, director of the French Institute of Oriental Archaeology, emphasized the archaeological and textual synthesis of temples, tombs, and papyri. His excavations at Saqqara, Thebes, and Abydos provided systematic documentation of ritual spaces, funerary texts, and cultic architecture. Maspero's approach integrated chronological analysis with textual interpretation, establishing patterns of divine kingship, mortuary practice, and temple ritual. By correlating inscriptions with architectural evidence, he demonstrated the continuity of religious institutions across dynasties and identified regional cults and local variations in practice. Kurt Seith, 1869 to 1934, advanced the study of Egyptian religious texts, particularly the pyramid texts, coffin texts, and Book of the Dead. Through careful philological work, Seith reconstructed linguistic, theological, and ritual nuances that had previously been inaccessible. His publications clarified the roles of major deities such as Ra, Osiris, Isis, and Thoth, as well as the symbolic functions of ritual action, divine kingship, and the afterlife. Seith emphasized the systematic logic of Egyptian cosmology, revealing how myth, ritual, and morality interlinked to sustain the broader cultural order. Erich Hornung, born in 1933, brought a comparative and interpretive dimension, analyzing temporal evolution, esoteric traditions, and theological sophistication. Hornung examined the interplay between Ma'at, kingship, and the afterlife, highlighting philosophical and ethical undercurrents in Egyptian thought. He also explored the interconnectedness of regional and state cults, the transformation of deities across periods, and the emergence of personal piety alongside formal temple worship. Hornung's work illustrates that Egyptian religion was not static but adaptively structured, capable of integrating political shifts, foreign influence, and evolving cosmologies. Archaeological evidence complemented textual analysis. Excavations at Abydos, Karnak, Luxor, and Amarna provided tangible context for textual sources, revealing temple layouts, sacred precincts, and ritual installations. At Abydos, researchers documented the enduring Osirian cult and its funerary significance, while at Amarna, the remnants of Akhenaten's monotheistic experiment offered insight into radical theological reform. These discoveries allowed scholars to map the development of Egyptian religious practice, from pre-dynastic cults to Hellenistic syncretism, with an emphasis on continuity, adaptation, and regional diversity. Comparative religion approaches enriched understanding. Scholars examined Egyptian theology alongside Mesopotamian, Greek, and Near Eastern systems, identifying structural similarities, shared motifs, and divergent innovations. Egyptian concepts such as divine kingship, cosmic order, and afterlife judgment were analyzed in relation to other ancient civilizations, illuminating broader patterns of religious thought. This method also highlighted the unique characteristics of Egyptian religion: its integration of ritual, cosmology, and governance, its durable priesthood, and its ability to adapt across millennia. Interpretively, academic reconstruction demonstrates that Egyptian religion functioned as a systemic and highly organized worldview. Deities, temples, rituals, and texts were not isolated elements but components of an interconnected ideological framework. Royal authority, temple economy, and popular piety formed a feedback loop sustaining the continuity of cosmology. Through the systematic work of Maspero, Seeth, Hornung, and their successors, modern scholarship has reconstructed these systems with historical fidelity, revealing both the philosophical depth and practical function of Egyptian religious life. Modern Egyptology has also clarified the social and political dimensions of religion. Temples were simultaneously spiritual centers, administrative hubs, and economic institutions. Priests maintained ritual precision while overseeing estates, workshops, and festivals, ensuring that religious, political, and economic functions were mutually reinforcing. Scholarship has demonstrated how this institutional structure allowed religion to adapt to dynastic change, foreign conquest, and Hellenistic syncretism, providing a model of cultural resilience and continuity. By the late 20th century, academic synthesis had produced a comprehensive view of Egyptian religion, integrating textual, archaeological, and comparative evidence. The reconstruction encompasses pre-dynastic practices, Old Kingdom cosmology, Middle Kingdom ethical innovation, New Kingdom imperial theology, and Ptolemaic syncretism. It demonstrates the interdependence of theology, ritual, kingship, and social organization, highlighting how religion functioned as a cohesive system rather than a collection of isolated myths. The work of modern scholars also shaped public understanding, influencing museum curation, education, and cultural discourse. Exhibits of papyri, temple reliefs, and funerary artifacts brought Egyptian religion to international audiences, while academic publications provided analytical frameworks for interpreting complex religious systems. This dual dissemination, academic and public, ensured that Egyptian religion was not only preserved in scholarship, but integrated into the global cultural imagination. By the conclusion of the 19th and 20th centuries, the cumulative efforts of explorers, philologists, archaeologists, and historians had resurrected the Egyptian cosmos from millennia of silence. Fragmented texts, ruined temples, and dispersed artifacts were synthesized into a coherent picture of a civilization whose religious thought shaped governance, social order, and cultural identity. Through meticulous analysis, modern Egyptology rendered the complexity, continuity, and adaptability of Egyptian religion visible to contemporary audiences, bridging the temporal gap between ancient practice and modern understanding. And that cosmos began to influence the modern imagination. Long after their temples crumbled, Egypt's gods found new altars in the mind. The symbolic and theological structures of ancient Egypt exerted profound influence on Western esotericism and religious thought from the Renaissance onward. Hermeticism, rediscovered through Greek translations of Egyptian wisdom texts, provided a foundation for Renaissance philosophers and occultists who sought to reconcile spirituality, cosmology, and human agency. Hermetic writings attributed to Thoth/Hermes Trismegistus emphasized universal laws, the correspondence between macrocosm and microcosm, and the pursuit of spiritual ascent. These principles were interpreted as ancient, authoritative sources of mystical knowledge, positioning Egyptian thought as a touchstone for philosophical and magical inquiry in Europe. During the 17th and 18th centuries, Egyptian symbolism was further incorporated into movements such as Rosicrucianism and Freemasonry. Rosicrucian texts invoked Egyptian deities, sacred geometry, and ritual motifs to frame allegories of spiritual transformation and secret knowledge. Freemasonry adopted Egyptian iconography, including obelisks, pyramids, and sphinxes, as symbols of wisdom, moral instruction, and the pursuit of enlightenment. These reinterpretations demonstrate the recontextualization of Egyptian religious motifs, divorced from their original temple-based practice but retaining symbolic potency. The cults of Isis and Osiris achieved a particular prominence in modern esoteric thought. Isis came to represent divine femininity, protection, and cosmic order, while Osiris embodied resurrection, moral authority, and the cyclical nature of existence. Their narratives were employed as archetypal frameworks, informing meditation, initiation rituals, and spiritual pedagogy. In this context, Egyptian myths were no longer tied to Nile temples or dynastic politics. They became universalized symbols of moral, ethical, and metaphysical principles. Literary and philosophical figures also contributed to the popularization of Egyptian motifs. Renaissance humanists, Enlightenment scholars, and later Romantic writers drew upon descriptions of Egyptian religion to explore mystery, immortality, and the nature of divinity. Iconography, mythological narratives, and hieroglyphic motifs appeared in art, literature, and philosophical discourse, illustrating the pervasive cultural resonance of Egypt's religious heritage. The reinterpretation of Egyptian deities in Western thought demonstrates both adaptability and enduring symbolic authority, allowing ancient cosmologies to influence ideas centuries after the decline of formal worship. Interpretively, the integration of Egyptian religious concepts into Western esotericism highlights the continuity of mythic resonance beyond institutional practice. While temples were destroyed and priesthoods dissolved, the core narratives, cycles of death and rebirth, divine kingship, cosmic order, remained compelling. Egyptian mythology provided structural templates for understanding human experience, ethical conduct, and the universe itself, demonstrating the capacity of ancient religion to inform abstract spiritual and philosophical frameworks. Esoteric adoption also shaped symbolic practice. Egyptian symbols were encoded in ritual, art, and ceremonial objects, often repurposed to convey moral and philosophical instruction. For example, the Ankh, scarab, and Eye of Horus became emblematic of life, transformation, and protection. These symbols were frequently employed in initiation rites, meditative exercises, and spiritual manuals, illustrating the transmission of Egyptian semiotics into modern frameworks of knowledge and practice. The enduring influence of Egyptian religious thought is further evident in the philosophical integration of cosmology, ethics, and esoteric practice. Hermetic texts, combined with Egyptian mythological motifs, provided models for understanding the interplay between divine order, human action, and natural law. This synthesis informed early modern science, natural philosophy, and metaphysical speculation, demonstrating that Egyptian religion could shape intellectual frameworks long after the original cultic context had vanished. By the 19th and 20th centuries, Egypt's mythic legacy had been firmly entrenched in the Western imagination. The resurgence of Egyptology, popular media, and literature reinforced the archetypal power of Egyptian deities, while esoteric movements continued to reinterpret their narratives to address contemporary spiritual and philosophical concerns. Isis, Osiris, Thoth, and other gods became enduring symbols of knowledge, morality, and transcendence, bridging the temporal gap between ancient temple practice and modern spiritual discourse. Economically and culturally, the fascination with Egyptian religion also shaped museum curation, architectural motifs, and artistic production. Exhibitions of papyri, statuary, and temple reliefs brought ancient cosmology to international audiences, while public fascination fueled literature, painting, and theatrical works that drew upon Egyptian myth. The symbolic and intellectual frameworks of Egyptian religion thus permeated Western culture, reinforcing the civilization's enduring legacy even outside of its original geographical and temporal context. In sum, the influence of Egyptian religion on Western esotericism and spiritual thought illustrates the adaptability and universality of its mythic and theological structures. Egyptian deities, cosmological narratives, and symbolic systems were reinterpreted, codified, and disseminated across centuries, serving as tools for philosophical reflection, moral instruction, and spiritual practice. This legacy underscores that the cultural and intellectual life of ancient Egypt persists, not solely through archaeology or textual scholarship, but as a living symbolic tradition that continues to inform the modern imagination. From mysticism to media, the Nile's myths flow onward. From sacred riverbanks to silver screens, Egypt's gods still shape our dreams. The fascination with ancient Egypt extended far beyond the academic and esoteric spheres, penetrating art, literature, and popular culture from the 19th century to the present. Victorian and Edwardian Orientalism, fueled by archaeological discoveries and Egyptological publications, portrayed the Nile Valley as a landscape of mystery, grandeur, and timelessness. Artists such as Jean-Leon Gérôme, Lawrence Alma-Tadema, and Lord Leighton depicted temples, pharaohs, and rituals with a combination of historical reference and imaginative interpretation. These works emphasized iconography, monumental architecture, and ceremonial spectacle, translating ancient religious imagery into the visual language of Western art, while shaping public perceptions of Egyptian culture. Literature similarly reflected and reinforced fascination with Egypt's myths. 19th-century novels and poetry often employed Egyptian settings and motifs as vehicles for exploring themes of immortality, divine justice, and hidden knowledge. The rediscovery of tombs and the decipherment of hieroglyphs inspired authors to integrate Egyptian cosmology, gods, and funerary symbolism into narrative form. Works such as Boris Pasternak's and H. Rider Haggard's fiction, as well as travel literature and scholarly essays, drew upon Egyptian mythology to craft stories of adventure, moral inquiry, and metaphysical speculation. These literary treatments created a cultural space in which ancient cosmology could resonate with contemporary concerns, from morality to mortality. The 20th century saw the expansion of Egyptian themes into cinema and mass media, reinforcing and globalizing their symbolic presence. Films such as The Ten Commandments, 1923, 1956, The Mummy, 1932, 1999, and Cleopatra, 1963, leveraged the visual and narrative power of Egyptian religious and royal imagery. Pyramids, tombs, mummies, and hieroglyphs became instantly recognizable icons, functioning as shorthand for ancient wisdom, mystery, and eternal life. These depictions, while often dramatized or fictionalized, maintained the structural motifs of Egyptian cosmology, death, resurrection, divine authority, and the tension between human agency and cosmic order, ensuring that core ideas remained present in collective consciousness. Mummies, in particular, emerged as enduring symbols in global popular culture. They embodied themes of resurrection, immortality, and moral consequence, directly tracing back to Osirian theology and funerary practice. The trope of the mummy both entertained and subtly transmitted elements of Egyptian religious thought, reflecting a fascination with life after death, divine retribution, and sacred ritual, albeit filtered through cinematic and literary conventions. Similarly, depictions of pyramids, temples, and sacred landscapes invoked the scale, symmetry, and ritual order of ancient religion, maintaining the aesthetic and symbolic language of Egyptian sacred architecture. Interpretively, the adoption of Egyptian imagery in art and media illustrates the permeability of religious symbols across temporal and cultural boundaries. Sacred forms originally tied to Nile-centered theology have been abstracted, recontextualized, and incorporated into global narratives. This process demonstrates the symbolic durability of Egyptian cosmology, capable of informing not only spiritual or philosophical frameworks but also aesthetic, narrative, and entertainment forms. Even when stripped of original ritual meaning, motifs of Osiris, Isis, and Ammonius continue to mediate ideas of morality, order, and transcendence for modern audiences. Egyptian myths also influenced architectural and design movements. The fascination with Egypt in Europe and America inspired Egyptian revival architecture, evident in museums, cemeteries, and public buildings. Obelisks, sphinxes, and hieroglyphic ornamentation appeared as markers of cultural prestige and historical continuity, linking modern space with the perceived grandeur of the Nile civilization. These incorporations reinforced Egypt's symbolic authority beyond textual or cinematic forms, embedding ancient mythology into urban and civic environments. In contemporary media, the fascination persists through novels, video games, graphic novels, and television. Popular franchises such as Assassin's Creed, Origins, and documentaries on streaming platforms explore Egyptian religion, gods, and temples with a mixture of historical accuracy and narrative engagement. These works not only entertain but also educate, familiarizing global audiences with the cosmology, ethics, and ritual structures of ancient Egypt. The continuing interest demonstrates that Egyptian mythology functions as both entertainment and cultural education, bridging millennia of history with modern storytelling. The sustained attention to Egyptian myths also reflects their archetypal power. Themes of resurrection, divine kingship, cosmic order, and moral accountability resonate universally, transcending the temporal and geographical origins of the Nile Valley. Even in secularized or fictionalized portrayals, Egyptian religious structures provide a framework for understanding life, death, and human aspiration, allowing ancient theology to continue shaping imagination, moral reflection, and cultural production. By connecting sacred motifs to contemporary forms of expression, Egyptian myths maintain a dialogue between past and present. Visual art preserves architectural and iconographic sophistication. Literature translates ritual and cosmology into narrative form. Film and digital media animate deities and myths for global audiences. Collectively, these manifestations ensure that the principles underlying Egyptian religion, order, rebirth, divine human interaction, and moral consequence remain perceptible, even outside formal temple contexts. In conclusion, the portrayal of Egyptian religion in art, literature, and popular culture highlights the perpetual resonance of the Nile's myths. Temples may have fallen silent, hieroglyphs may have been lost and rediscovered, but the gods, stories, and symbolic order continue to inspire, educate, and captivate. From Victorian canvas to modern cinema, the narratives of Osiris, Isis, and the pantheon flow into the global imagination, demonstrating that ancient Egypt remains a living source of cultural and spiritual influence. Thus, the journey from river to eternity completes its circle. Egypt's myths have endured for millennia, from the banks of the Nile to the pages of history, and into our modern imagination. Explore further, read the texts, visit the temples, and see for yourself how the gods shaped a civilization that still speaks to us today. Subscribe, watch, and join us as we continue uncovering the legacies of humanity's greatest civilizations.